Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Jules, and today is Saturday, the 4th of June 2011. Returning to the show is WebBot's inventor Clif from halfpasshuman.com. Clif, welcome back to the WebBot Forum Roundtable.
Thank you very much.
The WebBot Forum administrator is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us tonight. They include moderator Lolly and members Gemini, Alton, Lua, Thorus, and K. Sauber. For listeners, we assume you are familiar with Clif High and his work. If not, please go to halfpasshuman.com and purchase his reports and listen to a host of free interviews with Clif on our YouTube channel, webbotforum.com. Clif, do you have the wife preoccupied, dogs locked up, and coffee ready to go, sir?
Well, sort of. In the reverse order, the coffee's good, the wife's going to hit her breakfast here in a minute or so, and she'll be occupied. And the dogs are asleep, so we're good for a while.
Fantastic. We've broken the interview up into two sections. In the first part, we'll be discussing WebBot forecasts. In the second half, we'll be discussing spirituality and life, hopefully. Without wasting any more time, pie up. Our first question comes from Kirk. Kirk.
Hi, Clif. Have you seen anything in your data since your last report that you'd like to share at this time?
Yes, I will. I covered a little bit of it with Mel in the interview yesterday. Two things have occurred. One at a macro level, at a meta-arts level, if you will. I've noticed a very large shift in a pattern. It almost slapped me in the face, and that was a huge amount of immediacy data. So much so that the amount of pre-filtering processing had to be greatly increased, threefold. This is curious because we've seen some small level of immediacy creep over time from 97 to now, but a sudden ballooning was totally unexpected, and it was somewhat obscuring. In other words, it was hard to get through all of it just to get at anything that was meaningful beyond the next couple of weeks. So that was interesting. And then within the data itself, prior to the report getting eaten by our computer issues here, I'd run across a cross-linked set, or a set of cross-links that all revolved around the descriptor shock within the markets. And this descriptor within itself had referential integrity and internal cross-links to all kinds of market problems. And the shock level itself, when it first manifest, because of the way that the structure of the linguistics reference themselves internally and sort of spiral down, we know that this is going to be a multiple process or a multiple event process, and we think it'll start in this summer, probably relatively soon, probably very close to the solstice, continue across the summer, and then really impact in September, October. So it's as though let me put it this way, the emotional sums in the continuing release language that continues all the way till near the end of October, the emotional sums do not bottom out through the shock process until in September. So the process itself will have a tendency to accelerate the release since it's starting within the market's entity. I don't think it's going to be good kind of release language. I don't think it'll be a lot of people yelling, hooray, hooray, happy days are here again, or we have nothing to fear but fear itself, so let's get on, and all of that kind of thing. I think rather it'll be release language in the weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth style. So just sort of a heads up that it's going to be a very nasty summer economically, globally, for the whole pyramid scheme that is the dollar. That was another subset there that referenced how the dollar death will proceed now that we've, in essence, as a pyramid scheme, involved the whole planet, and therefore there's no one to sell our worthless paper to, and thus prop up the pyramid from below, so it's all going to sort of start crumbling down.
Wow.
Yeah, losing this report was not easy to take because of what we'd had to achieve first off with the ballooning of the immediacy data, which actually probably relates to the blank wall kind of an effect, at least in a couple of ways, in 2013. But also there were, I think, 9 out of 15 pages devoted to the shock and its impact through the global pop and the markets. Now, by the time I recreate the report, I'll be actually working on data that's forecasting from the end of July forward. So fundamentally, we're going to live through it. We won't have any kind of a real warning from it, which is why I bring it up now.
Well, I'm glad you did. I'd love to pursue this a little more, but I think that'll come in later. One of the forum members, JP, I should say, from Dataset Analysis 20, asked this, said the data sets are pointing to yet another instance of food crop poisoning tainting in May that will produce severe disease in a few months later in both consumers directly and market speculators indirectly. His question is concerning the new E. coli disease in Europe affecting vegetables. The strain is reported as being really nasty, resistant to all forms of antibiotics, and scientists have no clue as to where it came from. 2,000 people now infected in Germany with over a dozen dead. What are your thoughts on this stuff? How bad is it likely to get? Was this genetically modified by the local carrying powers that were?
It may indeed have been genetically modified in that there's some early suggestions that it's a spiral core bacterium, which is reasonably rare. That's a level of protection that the nucleus is usually seen in viruses and even hardened things like the biotin-covered spores from fungi and other such plants. So you don't usually see it in bacteria. Bacteria are more your Lebowski kind of critters out in the wild. They're just sort of cruising around and that sort of thing. The fact that it had the spiral also is why it's resistant to attempts to control it. So that's kind of an anomaly. Whether it was engineered that way or not, is speculation. So far we're running about 7.5% on the linguistics around the E. coli being going towards our food tainting in the large envelope that we had for summer. So if it progresses, we would expect that it would jump the continent and go to probably Africa first and then start being seen elsewhere. But that it's going to have to really impact the food supply to be the to reach the level of the forecast linguistics. Now, we could have forecast it too high, but it doesn't seem that way based on the kind of problems this E. coli is presenting, because not only do the people that don't die suffer a great deal in the process of not dying, it's unclear as to how much of a residual problem there will be for them. In other words, there's mortality and morbidity can take quite a while. Usually mortality is something seen in a relatively short order, right? This is how doctors think of it. And so morbidity is an over time kind of an issue. And we don't yet know how devastating the spiral bacteria will be to those people that survive it. So we have other examples of spiral parasitic activity on humans in nature. None of them are good. These include things like syphilis, and the residual effects of that are devastating even after you've killed the initial infection. So I'm not particularly sanguine about it. If it is the fulfillment of the language, then we'll see sort of a burst of it over perhaps the next 90 days. And we'll be able to tell just about the time that the economy and everything else is falling to bits, which actually may be sort of a saving grace. There's a whole series of anthropological articles about the idea that the degradation of the Roman Empire and other empires, especially the bridge builders, actually ended up being a good thing to limit the spread of disease, and this was proven up until the rebuilding of the bridges in the Middle Ages, which led to the Black Death. There hadn't been a major plague across the European area from the time that the Roman Empire collapsed and a lot of its bridges were burned, and thus isolating populations and so on and so on. So we may see that same net effect with a collapsing economy. It remains to be seen. But 7.5% or so is where we're at on the linguistics around that E. coli.
Okay. Do have a follow-up from Forum member MKB. British scientists have found a new strain of MRSA superbug in milk from cows and swab samples from humans and say it cannot be detected with standard tests. Have you seen this? Have you seen any information on it? And are they somehow connected?
It's likely they're connected, whether they're both natural or only one of them is a natural occurrence. MRSA is a methicillin-resistant golden staph, basically, and it's a staph infection. That's actually an engineering byproduct. MRSA is an engineering byproduct of how we do things. So, for instance, you can eliminate MRSA in one of its centers of origins, which is to say a hospital, by going through the hospital and replacing every single piece of metal that people contact with their hands, such as doorknobs, with copper. And when they do contact the copper, they get a microcharge, and the bacteria is not transmitted. Copper itself is a poison to bacteria and doesn't hold it. Yet in our hospitals, we use this cheap product, which usually is a porous form of stainless steel with a cheap molybdenum component, and or aluminum, again a porous material that supports bacteria. So MRSA is not like this deadly plague from space. Staphylococcus aureus has been around for a long time, and staph is itself probably carried by everyone, but it is an engineering side effect that is promoting it to be such a problem in our current society. Because at the same time that we were building our healthcare system with all these aluminum and porous stainless steel handles everywhere, as well as other porous stainless steel surfaces, thinking that these were sterile, we were bringing in the heavy-duty antibiotics into the food supply, which promoted the resistant bacteria to begin with. Make sense?
Perfect sense, and I happen to agree completely with that.
Yeah, so get copper and you're good to go. I mean, you can actually eliminate that at home by changing surfaces around you to copper, and if you've got carpets, it works even better because you'll get a mild electric shock every time you open and close the door. And this will eliminate MRSA as an issue in your household.
Well, thank you very much for that, and all of your answers so far.
Clif, hi, this is Gemini.
Hello.
Hi, it's a pleasure to speak with you this evening, and I'm asking a question on behalf of forum member Green Meadow. The summer of hell originally sounded like it was a single summer. Now it seems like each summer is a pre-echo of the hell of the following summer. How do you see the summer of hell MAME? What's going on MAME-wise do you see escalating this summer?
I agree that's with that observation, and that was probably certainly was one of the forecasts I make where we just assume it's a single event rather than us looking at the narrow end of a funnel, and that gets wider over time. But quite clearly we're into one of those funnel instances, what we call wide memes. This one here, we're going to see the social degradation of Europe to the point where we may see the collapse of the euro. Now, bear in mind that all of the currency forecasters that suggest that when the euro goes, the dollar goes 3 to 4 weeks later are quite correct. The empires collapse from the outer fringes inward, and that's exactly what's happening to our empire. And under the circumstances, I suspect that we'll see within the central part of our empire here, the new Roman Empire, that is to say the continental United States, the beginning of the fracturing that is expected as the empire's basic currencies are debased. Now, our debasement within this country may be different than than how the dollar is debased in other countries, but we will probably see stop out runs on the dollar in other countries. In other words, there may be a situation where, for instance, in Greece, an order goes out due to political turmoil that all currency exchanges are to stop as of 3 p.m. on this coming Friday, something like that. And what would happen is a run where people would attempt to second guess, if you will, to be prescient and see into the future, and they will attempt to get a spread of currencies that will do them good based on how they feel about their odds in their local situation as Greece goes through yet another presumed military coup, or at least the turmoil that suggests that. So we'll see that kind of thing occur, and that'll be the first sign of the euro's demise, because they won't be seeking the euro. As each of these countries go through their form of internal combustion, the whole of the artificial structure of the euro will collapse, as will the EC, the European Community. The issue here is really, it's magnificent to look at in the sense of the word magnificent as being ultimate, penultimate, acme, the alta of the experience, because here from the United States, we will be able to watch as its own form of empire, 350 million people large, succumbs to the forces. It's actually a battle between two forces. At the time they tried to create the European community and force it through everybody with the European trade zones, and then the European community, and then the European Union, and then the Central Parliament, and then the central currency, and all of this over the past 35 years, they have been, that is to say, the powers that be, have been working against a natural trend that was spreading through the populace of the planet. And that natural trend was towards more home rule, more tribal, more local, more connected, even as the society grew larger. And it is my estimation that the species as a whole has that as an inbuilt part of our collective consciousness to keep us from going absolutely batshit crazy. And that my supposition is that the species as a whole, our collective consciousness, knows that as we expand in numbers, in order to keep us cohesive, we have to shift our focus and eventually become bilocational, so to speak, where we can think at a species level and act that way at our local level with all of our local guys. And we'll focus more in a tribal level. That was clearly the developing trend that came out of the chaos of the late 50s and in through the 60s. Now, then they attempted to impose mega organizations on top of that chaos, and one of these centers of imposition was the European community. And as I say, it started off first as a trade zone and then starts working its way upward. That concept is now crumbling under the circumstances that we find ourselves living in, and we will see how such a thing splinters. And we'll see it this summer. The reason that that's important that we see that is because we will live through it here in the United States shortly thereafter. Maybe as little as 3 weeks, maybe as long as 3 months, but very shortly thereafter, we'll start feeling those same pressures here. And it may be that, say, some group gets really irritated and says, okay, that's it, like the Alaskans. They get really irritated because, for instance, the radioactivity is piling up in the Gulf of Alaska and no one just gives a damn, so they're going to go off and be their own country, that kind of thing. The forces that will be splintering America will work at that level as well as at the smaller level. ATMs breaking down and all of that kind of thing. I think there will be an interrelated component to the destruction of the system within the European community. So imagine this, as Greece and Spain and Portugal and Italy and ultimately France and Germany and Holland, etc., go through this, we're going to see a corresponding degradation in the stability that makes up the civilization. That'll be ATMs, that'll be grocery deliveries, that'll be bank openings, that'll be regular paid holidays, healthcare, train service, all of this kind of thing. Just as there's other pressures that on the Northern Hemisphere that are going to be impacting at the same time many of those same service deliveries. So we may see some rather dramatic failures in those just-in-time systems.
Wow, okay. And then, so the financial collapse, the 3 days around the world forecast is still on?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
The issue for us is the following. When we're looking at the data sometimes, it's as though we've got to press our eyes up against an aquarium and look through a little tiny hole in a sheet of paper. So we only get a pinhole, and we cannot tell how deep the object is. We don't have much in the way of depth perception. So we may get a clear picture of it, but not understand just exactly how big it is. Make sense?
It does make sense.
Okay.
And then I wanted to follow up on silver a little bit. Are you still seeing that reflected in your forecast of the 5 days up and possibly 20 showing up in the linguistics for the summer?
Yes, as it may be coincident with, I have no way of tying it to them by temporal marker, but it may be coincident with the problems that'll come through the European zone this summer. It'll certainly proceed across September and October, and that may be when we actually end up with our $20 days up and the breakthrough. But basically, you have to understand the silver isn't getting more valuable, the dollar's getting more worthless.
Okay, and do you have a temporal marker for the 3 days that we can expect to watch for?
I have a temporal marker, but I don't know the span between them. The temporal marker will be the general who gets on out and spills his guts about something on the media. So when we see that, that I know to be in the chain of events prior to the hitting the knee of the curve, so to speak, for the precious metals and other commodities. This will not be a good time, bear in mind, because this will not be occurring to silver alone. It will be occurring to everything that humans need, especially those things that we eat and burn for fuel.
Okay, Cliff, thank you.
Gemini? I'll ask the question from Green Meadow. Cliff, diaspora has been occurring in a general way all over, but there have been some massive forecasts for diaspora in the US. The 220 million number includes mentions of an upper-level minion divorce as a temporal marker, and crossing great rivers to the north, latitude 50, etc. Ill winds, people dying in the journey, and assistance from tribal peoples. One of the reports suggested this might occur in late 2011. Can you tell us more about this diaspora and anything in your recent report?
The recent report that got ed up, I had yet to hit the, looks like the crew is here, but I'd yet to hit the Terra entity, so I can't tell how close we are to this. But the description of the event back in the day when the language was forecast was pre-Fukushima. So now we have the following situation, which I touched on in the interview with Mel, but I didn't go into any detail. Back then we had the 220 million people having to rush north at some peril. They were in a fear mode trying to get north. It appeared to occur in this year, 2011. It appeared to occur in a bad weather situation. It appeared to occur in North America. We didn't have a lot in the way of a cause for the activity that begins the push north, and then we had a lot of detail in some of the descriptors describing the push north without really understanding why. Now, it makes a lot more sense now, this side of the Fukushima event, because as things become nastier and nastier and nastier with Fukushima not being corrected, and the accident or accident by design from BP that shut down the loop current and in turn shut down the Gulf Stream, the radioactivity is becoming concentrated in the northern hemisphere. It may become so concentrated that no amount of spin or mind control drugs or whatever will be able to deny the fact. And at that point, we may see that the populace rushes north because there is currently a curious safety zone north of 50 in the northern hemisphere. And it's looking more and more as though radioactivity will be the driving force, and that the Fukushima event and perhaps pending events will promulgate, and we may have misinterpreted the 9 passages of the ill winds, because it may be that the ill winds should have been just interpreted as existing, and then the number 9, instead of being applied to the number of times around the planet, maybe we should have applied that to like 9 sources to pollute the ill winds or something along those lines in terms of an interpretation. I don't have that data set anymore, so I can't go back and look at it just because they're too large to keep, and we have to take a snapshot and get the next report and then throw it away and then go on to the next one. But at this point, what if we're hit by a very large earthquake that affects yet more nuclear plants, most of which are clustered in the northern hemisphere, and we get yet more radiation into the already radioactively polluted system that we're starting to live in? We're going to soon reach a point where there will be a collective consensus to move.
Thank you, Cliff. It's just confusing in the sense that you have data saying diaspora north of latitude 40, 50, but then you have the powers that were migrating to the southern hemisphere. So which do you think is it?
Well, look at it this way. I think it's both. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. The powers that be knew it was coming in advance, so they went ahead and took their money and bought land in Paraguay and had underground places built and all of this kind of thing. If any of us had had the knowledge that it was happening in advance and had vast quantities of money, we might have done the same. But for all of the rest of us who are suddenly going to be forced to live with the knowledge that staying put equals some level of risk of death, disfigurement, etc., that it's kind of like a herd mentality. At least that's how I'm assuming it will play out. That the seed thought will somehow be expressed, and it will go through the herd fairly rapidly, and then we'll see something of a panic.
Thanks, Cliff. Alton, you have a question.
Yes. Hi, Cliff.
Hello.
This question is from Uranus Rising. In your Scottish sovereign interview, you spoke of the underlying assumptions inherent in Christianity as it had been put out into the Western world will be in a huge state of chaos in 2013, and at the center of that chaos will be Great Britain. Any more info, data on the UK religious Reformation, revolution, and questioning of the whole king, queen, divine right to rule?
No, I hadn't gotten to that part because in this past report, so no, I'm sorry, I've got no new data that way. The global pop is one of the larger ones, and it's one of the last ones I do. Sorry, I hadn't hit that. I was so captivated by the market and all the cross-links going back out from the shock. But there is one thing we can say quite clearly, that it is not good for monarchs and rulers of all stripes when instability exists in those who would be ruled. So the level of instability that we see coming globally as a result of the dollar death in all of its forms doesn't bode well for any monarchs anywhere or any government anywhere, because it'll be virtually impossible to control the ripples that are going to go on through. Bear in mind that basically all paper currencies are supporting the monarchies. They exist only to serve the monarchy. They're one of the last vestiges of the divine right to rule, because somehow these people have a divine right to print money and charge us interest in the printing, and thus make us instant slaves, because they loan you $1 and expect $1.05 back without that 5 ever being created. So it's a Ponzi scheme from the beginning, and all of these pyramid schemes collapse when you can't add a greater sized layer at the bottom. And we've reached a planet that is totally polluted with it now, and we can't add any larger layers at the bottom. And we're at this this nexus that is actually terrible and going to be huge, and it's going to ripple around the planet many times as we get to watch how empires implode. It's going to be, as I say, rather magnificent. Now, how much of the riotous nature of the soccer hooliganism will take over in the British case, I think, is yet undecided, but the outcome is not good for the royals, that's certain.
Well, now, there's a follow-on question here, then. Is the recent hallmark Scottish election towards independence connected with this?
No, it may be in its own way. It's in its own way. It's an expression of the underlying "let us be sovereign" kind of a thing. But no, we actually exclude political movements, etc., from our data capture, from our processing, because they're so easily manipulated.
Okay. Well,
so for instance, we find an interesting set of linguistics, and it's really, really neat. I ran into this frequently in the beginning, and I would go and I'd track it down to see what its source was. This is like in 2001, and I would go back and find out that this very interesting set of linguistics would go to the Green Party or go to Amnesty International or whatever. And then I started seeing the patterns in how this interesting language came out of the center of all of these supposed group organizations, and realized that they were as much a hierarchical corporate structure as anything else. And therefore, during that period of time in dealing with the lexicon, I went through and made a huge list of politically associated words, and we screen by those, because the level of manipulation is so high.
Okay, well, now then there's one more follow-on question then. Any more info data on the 2, possibly 3 Gandhi-ish people who will be leading in this direction?
Sorry, nothing new, because I hadn't gotten that far. Usually personalities are at the very tail end of the order in which I do it usually starts with markets, goes on into populous USA. Unless there's a very large amount of growth in Terra, then I might start there. Terra and Global Pop are the larger 2, excepting Space Goforts has grown greatly. It's so the order would have it be otherwise. Sorry, I never got that far. Personalities are layered within the detail, and I don't get to those until I scope out all the archetypes, all the primary, secondary, tertiary support, and then the supporting chain for each of those in turn.
Good. Makes sense. All right.
Okay,
we're
good.
going to, well, no, it really does on a lot of levels. I'm going to move on to the next question here. In Shape 10, it's just chock full of events directly related to electric universe theory. With the occurrence of the bipolar disease, how probable is it that this forking of the magnetic field lines, making the multiple south poles, will continue to fork out similar to the branching we've seen in what are known as Lichtenberg figures, dendritic patterns, to a fine enough level to affect individual humans? Will this occur in the northern hemisphere also?
That's a very interesting thought. I never thought of it fracturing down so far as to affect individual humans. There's nothing that would say it couldn't. The data we had, I didn't pursue it down that far because I thought I'd captured enough of the essence, and these reports are demanding and precious on time, so I can only go so far. But maybe indeed, if I'd gone down deep enough, I would see something along those lines. That's kind of a very interesting thought, that Gaia may be breaking up the consciousness and coming along and sort of like encapsulating us individually. The toroid effects I saw within the data set were at a much higher level, and through crosslinks I knew that they were being effective of large groups, but that may be just how humans are going to discuss it. Because, for instance, since any human that has a disease is affected at an individual level, but we nonetheless discuss that disease at a collective level, like, the flu is going around. But yet the flu isn't going around. Individual humans are in turn suffering the symptoms of the flu in that sense. So the flu itself doesn't exist. but our concept of how we discuss it would have it be otherwise. And so I may have fallen into that trap when looking at that data, and the questioner may be quite correct. It may indeed be the fracturing of the toroid down to such a small level that individual humans are affected, and I just fell into the trap of seeing it as a collective flu as opposed to individual symptoms.
Interesting. Now we have a question here from forum member Green Meadow. Do you have any sites that track magnetic anomalies, and what should we be watching for signs of the multiple south poles?
I don't have any sites that track it. There's a number of them out there. You only have to put in magnetosphere anomaly within quotes in most search engines to get quite a sizable listing. We have a special set of references within our spiders that seek out such sites that contain discussions of magnetic anomalies. And this is one of those that we can run in deterministic mode, and I just run it that way to bring in validation on some of my thinking. So, for instance, it was through some discussions in a Polish language. I think it's been a while. I can't remember exactly where it was, but it was in Polish or Russian. It was like January, February of last year. It was brought back by the spider that seemed to suggest that we're actually at the end of a magnetic impact as a result of the change of the sun, and that the magnetic impact was what was causing the apparent light changes. And if this was the case, then we could see that the sun itself would not have changed if we could perform the following experiments over time. And one of those experiments I've just completed, and I can say that the supposition that the sun has not changed is inaccurate. It has indeed changed, and it's not a magnetic issue, because the postulate had been that the harshness of the sun that's been here in recent years, the lack of a yellowness to it, and the apparent harsh increase in actinics, as well as the increase in a new form of ultraviolet, higher level frequencies in that range, and the subsequent impact on crops and so on, could be explained by magnetic problems. So I went ahead and figured out a way to test this and determine that that's not the case. The light has actually changed. We're no longer receiving the red and the orange and the yellow the way we did in the 1800s, because I was able to find an antique prism in good condition where it was a teaching prism, and they'd had little tiny lines etched in it that separated the spectrum at clear delineations, and it's no longer accurate when used accurately. So our collective assumption that the light has changed is accurate in the discussion in the Russian language forum about the magnetosphere being the cause by a lens effect is inaccurate. But getting back to the question about the magnetosphere in terms of what we should look for and so on, I don't have any sites that track it. If you do look for it, I found the most useful information, even translated through Babelfish, to be coming out of some Polish discussion boards and some Russian ones, where some people are very cognizant of what's going on in the sun, and they take a lot of the European space data and discuss it as rational adults, and none of what they're saying is particularly encouraging. So it's like, go and read it at your own risk, because it can give you a rather negative view of things.
Very good. One last question here, Cliff, before I hand you off to Lolly. As this electric charging of the Earth continues, one of the predicted effects is the intensifying of the jet streams. How will this impact the winds and wind speeds on the surface of the Earth where we humans interact? And to expand that, is that in any way connected to the ill winds?
We didn't ever see it as connected to the ill winds because of the way the ill winds pattern was set up and our discussions about that. The impact on the jet stream, though, is its own predictable how do I want to say this? It has certain predictable consequences. The problem for us is that the powers that be and or natural human stupidity, if we want to believe that, have created a situation in which the BP oil disaster caused the shutdown of the loop current, which in turn caused the shutdown of the Gulf Stream, which in turn has impacted how the jet streams flow. Now, there may or may not be a more sinister hand behind it all in the sense of HARP or, this kind of crap, right? But nonetheless, we now have to deal with the consequences of this. And we're dealing with those consequences in the now, in the sense that, we've recently had Joplin. We've had a tremendous increase in tornadoes, tornado deaths, tornado heights, tornado wind intensities, tornadoes speed across the land. You name any statistic, we're at some extreme level of it relative to tornadoes this year. Usually, in fact, we're tenfold increase in a month on both the number of tornadoes and the number of people dead from tornadoes. So those impacts are here. They're dramatically here. I don't expect them to be reduced. If anything, we should expect that they'll really increase over the rest of the season. Now, when we wrote the report, I can't remember if it was this last shape or if it was the shape before that discussed the issue of hurricanes and cyclones this year. There was some question at the time that I put it out as to whether or not the data would be accurate the way that I was interpreting it, because it was ambiguous. At one point, it could have been an interpretation that said there's going to just be a ton of hurricanes with lots of damage that's going to contribute to an already nasty tornado season. Or it could have been interpreted as saying that the military is going to use HARP and all of its stuff to prevent a bunch of hurricanes from emerging and merging with a tornado season and being a really nasty event. At the moment, we're right on the, and I'm saying at the moment, we're right, meaning today and as of last night with the formation of the most recent tropical lows that could become hurricanes, we're right on the cusp of seeing how that's going to play out. The rest of the language seemed to suggest that the military would not stop this, and we would have not only the summer of hell or the mother of all tornado seasons, however you want to think of it, but also the corresponding event or version of that within the hurricane season as well. There's been a noticeable lack of hurricanes for a number of years. If we take the issue of BP out of the picture and take the issue of the jet stream out of the picture and just consider how the military has been keeping the hurricanes away, this creates an imbalance. Those imbalances have to be dealt with somehow within the global system. So, for instance, it is part of the function of hurricanes to take heat from the equator and move it to the North Pole. So if the military, by a virtue of scalar technology and HARP, is able to steer a hurricane away and dissolve it, how does that heat, which must in our collective system travel to the North Pole in order to be dissipated, and also by that way to bleed heat off of our planet, how is it to get relieved? And so these imbalances are going to build up regardless of BP's action. If we throw BP in there as a deliberate attempt to come along and say, well, basically a pre-Fukushima to you all, then okay, that's probably an issue of the powers that be already aware of certain conditions and facts and taking advantage of that to push their agenda by making some rather strategic moves. In this case, the hurricane season thing will probably start playing out if it's going to be the issue of the military just standing back or not having the capacity anymore to direct the hurricanes away, given the current state of imbalance in our winds, the increase in the jet stream, the bilocation of the planetary winds at the jet stream level, meaning no cross-equatorial mixing, which, by the way, isolates all the radioactivity to this narrow band in the northern hemisphere. Then we may see that we will be, I don't want to say abandoned because we don't know that that's the case, but the effect will be the same, that we'll just be hammered by hurricanes at the same time that we've got tornadoes coming down every which way, and that the general wind speed at all extremes has increased. That increase is probably going to be quite substantial. There are some theoretical limits, though. So, for instance, at the ground level, it's not possible, as far as we know, on the size of the Earth as we used to understand it. It's not possible to have a 300-mile-per-hour wind. That may be changing as the Earth expands.
Okay. So it's sort of like the controllers are attempting to regain control?
Well, no. Let me put it to you this way, okay? The puzzlement for me has always been the many threads of evidence pointing to a planetary population reduction. Either all of these threads were placed there as a fear marker to make us all afraid and start this general level of fear that they could manipulate, or those items actually are evidence of a desire on the part of the populace, or the powers that be, to control the size of the populace. Yet I could never fathom that, because I was thinking, well, surely these people know that it takes all of us to support their lavish lifestyles. And without all of us, they're going to be severely impacted by how much good stuff they have. And they only have a lot of good stuff when there's a lot of humans. So there was never any net gain for them, in my opinion, to be stupid about how they manage the planet. Yet they continually appeared to be stupid. So I figured, well, it was maybe stupidity by design. Now, why would they ever want to eliminate the vast majority of the populace? And it just made no sense whatsoever. And then there has arisen, at least in my part, an understanding of one set of conditions that would explain it. And that set of conditions can be likened to the running to the extreme level of resource use. And if we were to consider the planet as a closed system like a petri dish, and our population as a bacterial colony within that closed system, then at some point we reach the limit that we can absorb nutrients from the system before the next generation must crash hard, because we've sucked out nearly all of the nutrients over the preceding 10, 12, 15 generations, whatever it is. In our case, as humans, it might be a 13,000-year cycle for all we know. But under those conditions, it makes sense, because the powers that be would certainly not want a populace in revolt due to lack of foodstuffs at a primary level to be occurring, because that is zero level of control. When you get to that level of chaos, they have zero level of control. And they like levels of control that are near 100%, and they want to get us as close to that 100% as they can possibly do so. And that really means that at some point, when they know that their ability to allow us to consume resources has reached a finite level. In other words, we can't add another layer to our pyramid scheme on the bottom relative to the biota on the planet, and we're reaching the limit of a giant ecological collapse, which will kill off a great many of us anyway, then it makes sense for the powers that be to initiate a depopulation program, just so that they are in control of the depopulation process itself, at least so far as they think. Make sense?
Makes much sense. Thank you so much, Clif.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Hi, Clif. This is Lolly.
Yeah, hello.
Good to speak with you. Last week we interviewed Dr. Joseph Farrell. I'm wondering if you had an opportunity to listen to that interview.
No, it's been a week from hell as we got into this. So no, I have not yet.
Okay. Well, he speculated that the weapons are being used to test and gather data, and therefore some of the earthquakes and extreme weather we're observing may be a product of this testing. I note here the earthquake swarms in Turkey, Nevada, and today we're seeing some in Argentina, and perhaps the deadly tornadoes in the southeast of the U.S. These events and others may not be naturally occurring phenomena, but man-made. Dr. Farrell also speculates that the use of these weapons is affecting solar activity, and again, some of what we are observing solar activity-wise may not be a natural occurrence, as Patrick Gerald's work and others might suggest, but the effects of human technology. His comment was that this was the really big story. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this premise, on Dr. Farrell's thoughts.
Yeah, I've explored the idea from reading McCanney and a bunch of the Electric Universe guys, as well as looking at some of Tom Bearden's stuff, that you could get a backflow through some of the scalar technologies and create these connections to the sun that would theoretically allow you to influence it. And such of the technology that they talk about, some of it anyway, is the Tesla arrays. The idea is that you can get a pulse generated that causes a sympathetic response in the larger body at a distance over the course of time. And of course it's going to require a certain amount of energy. I would agree with part of his premise that the events we're seeing appear to have a signature other than previous examples of natural occurring patterns. So in that sense, Haiti was anomalous, and the large Chile quake was anomalous, and there's anomalous conditions that existed about the Honshu quake prior to the tsunami that took out Fukushima. And indeed, they could be scalar weapons, and they're testing them and saying, okay, let's do this and that. There could be a war going on, whether you think of it as a atomic bomb test, or that kind of thing. The net result is a war going on. Now, I've seen a great many weird things with these glasses out, whizzing about in space, some of which I would not instantly recognize as being originating with a human mind. Just the way these craft moved had initiated a xenophobic response in me saying, hey, humans didn't invent that. We wouldn't do it that way, right? And so I would accept his premise that shit's on fire, but as to who actually lit the match and whether it was a local human or not, I don't know that I would be willing to speculate that far. And then as far as to whether or not it's affecting the sun, Tesla's work, and I've read a lot of it, suggested that he had some indications that it was technically feasible, but even he speculated that the amount of energy at the time he needed could not be found on Earth. Now, he may have, I didn't pursue that any further at the time, and he may have been just speaking about electrical generation capacity as opposed to total levels of energy. I don't know. But it may be an energy issue that you may still, even though you're trying for a resonance effect, you may still need vast quantities of energy beyond what we're capable of generating at the moment in order to get this to occur. And also I need to point out that, the sun has 98% of the mass in the solar system. So, if the sun, if the surface of the sun ripples in annoyance, we have a couple of bad millennia out here as planets.
Okay, thank you. The next question, in shape 1, your data had late 2011, time in which a wave will race from the South Pole to the North Pole over the course of a half day, 12 hours. This wave will be the result of the separation of a truly gigantic ice mass from Antarctica. Is this still in your forecast, and any time frames?
The last time we looked at all of this, there was in the Terra entity, the supposition is that we're still looking in northern hemisphere late fall into winter, so October, November, or December. We still show it within the Terra entity. The wave itself is, how do I say it? It's not particularly a terrible thing. It's not a tsunami that on the level of what hit Japan, for instance. So it may be even a minor event, and it may be lost in what we've got going on at that period of time, because let me back up a little bit here. In the last report we were discussing, and I think even the report before that, so the previous 2 shape reports, we had been discussing the October tipping point into building tension. And now when I last looked at the data, we were in fact looking at 3-pronged asymmetrical, sort of a trident shape. And that what we're actually looking at is a sudden buildup of building tension language to a little peak in late October that almost instantly falls as we go into November into another cup shape that's very deep but not very wide. We have another sudden ramp up and then another fall and then a larger one in December. And so really the tipping point now into building tension is in December, but even then the building tension, while it rises very steeply, doesn't last very long, and then we go into release language again. A lot of this in that area from October onward.
Are you there, Clif? He's gone.
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, I'm still here. There's some level of interference going on. Yes, can we just pick up?
Yep.
Okay, so the Terra entity is what drives those emotional shapes within that part of our process from October through into 2012. There's a lot more Terra entity driving with of the model space, even though its growth rates are not as large as some of the other entities, its emotional sum levels are larger, and its effect on the overall mass of the trend lines of how humans are going to proceed emotionally is larger than the other entities. And so it still seems on. A lot of it is still Antarctic focused. There's all kinds of stuff about the ocean. But again, I don't know that the Antarctica stuff will be as dominating as we once thought, simply because there's a lot more chaos going on. And if we're all really worried about food at a very day-to-day level, we may not even hear about it. We may not even care anymore. A lot has changed in this last report. Not in a good sense either.
Thanks, Clif.
Thanks, Cliff. We might just have a quick 1 minute putty break, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I've still got good coffee and water here, and I'm watching them back this truck up. So yeah, no problem.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, we're now talking about the data wall, data gap hard stop. Kirk, you got a question for Cliff?
Yes, Cliff. I know this is something of a moving target, but can you now clarify on the data wall as you see it?
There's a number of possible explanations, and I'd had them all well formulated, and I thought I knew what the hell was going on in a broad sense. And then I ran into this issue of having to filter and refilter as the last report was being prepared. And it increased my processing time. Of course, I'm acutely aware of that, so I really dug into it, and I started looking at some stuff. Now, it's made me throw out a couple of previous hypotheses and formulate some new ones. I don't know that the hypotheses stand the test of time or will stand the test of time, but here's some of the interesting data. There has been a definitive shift in language, as though the vast sheeple of the planet are no longer even mildly curious about what's going on. They deliberately don't want to know. It is as though the herd knows it's about to go racing off the cliff, but it's running full speed, and it just doesn't want to know about the results of this. There's just been this weird shift in the language. We saw it in the ballooning of the immediacy values. Now, the coincident fact of the internet being disrupted this year, which arose coincident to our predictions of the first data holes appearing, because we had the first data holes appearing in January of 2011, and as we went forward into this year, we started seeing various countries around the planet exercising levels of censorship and control and so on. So there's still the potential and probability that the censorship issue comes into it. Now, at that level, the hard stop may be the rise of absolute governmental control at some level, requiring licenses, etc., that we're not in a position to be able to meet or whatever, and we end up having to shut down. So it wouldn't be so much as a result of the internet changing or everybody being killed off at that particular date, but it may be indeed a result of how the powers that be respond to the events that they're afraid of, and they're continuing to clamp down. Plus, we now see that there's moves afoot within France and the European community, as well as our Congress, that specifically go to the idea of basically a commerce-only Internet. And you're not allowed to embed videos, you're not allowed to discuss things that were copyrighted by someone else. So it shuts down the idea of discussion boards, all of this kind of thing. And it's been really hammered out in detail at the E8. Instead of the G8, this is the E8, because these are all of the IT guys that were dragged along with the politicos this last 4 times. And they've got it down to a fairly nice control grid that they think that they can implement. And there's even a plan to start in some of their economic powerhouses like Germany. And there's even a corresponding plan on how they would attempt to implement it here in the United States. But the effect would be a creeping level of censorship such that all of our source goes away in the form of all of the discussion boards, etc., basically at the same time as all of the research, or however you want to characterize it, truth movements, woo-woo, woo-joe, whatever kinds of sites are clamped down on and made to pony up with licenses and thus toe the government line or not. And so that's the kindest, gentlest form of explanation for what started as a data holes and gets to a data hard stop. And it makes sense with the timeline of how long it takes government to exercise this kind of stuff. It makes sense that with the timeline of the government now discussing the idea, they don't ever discuss in public anything that they haven't already agreed upon, bear in mind. So the mere fact that they're discussing it says they are in fact doing it. It's not a hypothetical, it's not a maybe. It is just how they're introducing the idea to you, that they're going to preserve your commercial rights, but they're going to cut down on all of this terribleness of all of the spam and the viruses and all of this sort of thing with the new and improved Internet. And you'll like it a lot better, so don't worry. Now, there's that. Then we've also found this huge increase in, and by huge I mean 3-fold, maybe 4-fold increase in immediacy data relative to longer-term data. That can be explained also by a censorship approach that may be being exercised. So follow me here. If one had gained an understanding, as I have, of the emotional attachment in terms of time to linguistics, then one could relatively easily write a series of programs that could be used to scrub specific language types from discussions in other easily accessible areas based on their temporal duration values. And there's some evidence, Igor here thinks he's found some evidence, and he's in the process of writing a script that may prove this, but he's got his own issues with his wife's health and so on, so we won't have any definitive results for a while, if ever. But he's attempting to validate his premise that indeed there's some mega scrubbing going on, and that it's a deliberate attempt to whittle us down, so to speak. He's paranoid at a level I'm not. That would take a huge amount of programming effort, and I don't know that they would go to that trouble just to bully on us when we're so easily bullied other ways that don't cost very much, which they do all the time. So I don't buy that until he can prove it, but nonetheless, it's possible. Now, he's looking at that shift in the data from one viewpoint, and I'm looking at it from another. And one of the things I think I may be seeing is a shift in the data towards a dampening down, as I've said, of the willingness to know, the desire, the attachment of an emotional, I wish this, to the idea of knowledge that seemed to be almost palpable within the sheeple as recently as 4 months ago, and is now maybe half that level in emotional intensity. Though the newness of the shift into the immediacy values, the reduction of the longer-term value sets over time, because we've been experiencing this over the last year, and the some of the alterations in the language suggest that there is something definitively happening related to what we'd called the data gap, and we now see as the hard stop. But specifically what it is, I don't know. But at least that explanation would allow us to survive beyond 2013 without being scrubbed off by a giant solar flare.
But Clif, sorry, the willingness to know I can understand, but in regards to a new Internet 2 where only certain people would have access, I mean, people would still be viewing the new Internet 2 version, so they would still have psychic leaks past the data gap and have legal language, even though it was restricted. So, I mean, that's pretty hard to imagine that would be the data.
No, it doesn't quite work that way. People would indeed be able to see, because people are psychic, they would know that this level of fascism is coming, and how would they express that in their language? They may express it at a level where imagine, let me put it to you this way, in a broad metaphorically archetype. If we all as a super consciousness expressing as individual consciousness are aware that there's a big giant looming space goat fart, fascism, whatever coming our way, we may express that knowledge not in the language itself, but in a lack of the language. Ones and zeros, right? And so just because we've been using ones, somethings, doesn't necessarily preclude us from not using nothings. Make sense? So in other words, the holes that we're seeing in the data for some period of years may have been how we express the idea that the ability to communicate at this level is going to go away because of government fiat.
Okay. Just one quick thing. If it isn't the Internet being changed.
Right.
Previously in a GLP interview, you mentioned that prior to the data gap in March 2012, you saw some spikes in some data sets. I think one was the sun disease. Do you see any spikes prior to the March 2012 data gap hard stop that might indicate what it is?
We don't have any change in those. That's the problem. So the last time we looked at those, which was the beginning of this year in January, when we had we're going through the gigantic Terra entity that was in that, was focus for that report, and we looked at the sun disease. We still have huge spikes of those occurring all through this year, and then a very large ramp up through to March of 2013. So while the level of values have changed, the overall proportions within those values relative to the other values and the lack of any other data has not. So the structure of the holes didn't change. We didn't get any more data in between the holes that was in any way different within that run since January and through into this last one, which was eaten up in the malware. So sorry to say, no. The prognosis is if it's not the Internet, then it's going to be giant solar flares, and that still is what we keep seeing in the powers that be entity as their primary driving fear. And it always, again, I was always puzzled by the actions of the powers that be relative to the memes of the fear that supposedly was driving them, as that fear had been repeated in the Wuzhou. So it was always that, oh, well, the powers that be are deathly afraid of a giant cataclysm in 2012, and that's why they're going underground. Makes sense. But not if that cataclysm is a crustal shift. Because they would certainly know that anything underground is going to be ground into salt and pepper. And so they wouldn't go underground. The fact that they were building underground kind of meant that it wasn't a crustal shift, but I could never see the mechanism. And once I saw the mechanism, it made a lot of sense. The expanding Earth doesn't require that you have a crustal shift in order to cause damage on the surface, and it would be safe in certain areas underground, those areas that had yet to fracture, unless you were looking at an expansion event beyond anything that we could understand, in which case the Earth may become so large in that kind of an expansion event that nothing over the size of a mouse could exist, for instance, because you couldn't pump blood to your brain. In terms of, we don't know how large these expansion events are. We don't know how rapidly it was that the dinosaurs were killed by their own anatomy relative to that, and how we all shrank down to our current size. But a large enough expansion theoretically could cause this. But anyway, the powers that be are there digging underground. We have evidence for this. The minions are heavily involved in it. There's a whole huge industry involved. It's been sucking cement for years, and it made no sense. But it does now. And that would be because it would be great against solar flares for brief periods where you had to retreat and then you could come out, and then you had to retreat and and then you could come on out. It doesn't do very much good for those of us that can't retreat, though. That is another explanation for the data gap, because it would maybe affect populations in a holing fashion, if you will. Rather than irradiate the whole population of the planet at a time, it may be bursts, and so getting through the holes in the magnetosphere and causing the population reduction by way of punching in a metaphor. And so you'd take a sheet of paper and reduce it down to nothing by punching out little dots, in essence, and that would certainly fit the pattern of the lack of data we've got. Either explanation still stands. We just don't know for sure. The puzzlement for us has been the rapid growth and immediacy data.
Okay, Lua, you've got a follow-up question about the data gap?
I certainly do. My question is in regards to the data death. Do you still see any data coming in from 2015 to 2017, or from 2040 to 2041? Or did the data for then go poof when you tweaked the lexicon?
It went poof.
It went poof.
Yes, there was. That's why I'm calling it a hard stop now, is because that past the May, I want to say 13th, but I think it was May 21 of 2013. There just is no data. So our earlier view of this had been the following. Here we are looking at an aquarium that's filled with millions of really rapidly moving, very attractive tropical fish, but we can't see them all. We're looking through a little tiny pinhole. If we move our pinhole further out, we can see more of what's going on, but we of course lose clarity as we do so because our focal length is constrained by the pinhole. Now, here we are moving the aquarium along, all the fishes are swimming, and all of a sudden we start seeing little black areas where all of a sudden the fish that used to be there isn't there. And then by the time we get to the point in 2013, earlier, it had been as though there was an area in which no fish would swim, like a deoxygenated layer of water that was vertical within the aquarium. There just was nothing there. But on the other side, there were a few of these brightly moving little dots. That no longer exists. We no longer have the brightly moving dots on the other side. It is as though, I know for a fact how we do the processing. The tweaking the lexicon removed that as an artifact of programming, and that had always been an artifact of programming.
I'm really having a hard time with my imagination level here. If there is absolutely no data gap at all, I'm having a real hard time with figuring out how there can be people. How is anything but annihilation?
It may indeed be that way. I have no way of discerning at this stage that there is anything beyond annihilation. But there are other explanations for why our system would report it this way that don't include annihilation. But it's also very feasible to suspect that this is a species extinction level event, and especially since there's evidence that we're in a giant extinction level event for other species at the moment. So it indeed is still a valid explanation.
Is it possible that we could be talking about a high percentage without absolute annihilation and still have a complete loss of data?
Sure. Because our level of granularity has never been 1-for-1 or any of that kind of thing, so we've always been aggregating. And again, the universe favors this. The data that we have now in the form of ancient records in a number of languages, where we can get specific references to previous cataclysms, have suggested that this very last one, 13,000 years ago, was a real terrible one, and very few of us came through. Maybe as few as 10,000 breeding pairs. And but nonetheless, universe favored us, and that small amount did come through. Whereas previous times, especially on the now can't find it anymore Narmer plate, it discussed some of the previous times where, hey, it wasn't a big deal, okay, a third of the population died and we got the crap kicked out of us and all the houses had to be rebuilt, but we're good to go,
Well, I want to thank you for that. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say that question, the original one, came from Diane VG from the forum.
Oh, okay.
And thank you very much for your time.
Sure.
Clif, this is Gemini again, and
Sure,
I wanted you to give us your insight into the quickening of time and the thinning of the veil of awareness and manifestation. Are they driven independently, or is there a common causality?
You can think of them as being independent, but of course there's no such thing as independence within the materium. The materium exists as a result of the pulse that determines its flow. So causality results from the ability of those items within the materium to move and shift, and thus there is an apparent connection between cause and effect, and the result of the vibration changes within materium, how do I want to say this, are also driving, hang on a second, I'm getting some, okay, I guess we're all right down there. Getting all kinds of disruptions on my machine at the moment, so we may lose a connection here.
Okay.
All right, hang on. Yep. Hello? Am I back?
There he is, yes.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, I've gotten some kind of, I don't know what it was at the BIOS level coming on in. Where were we at? What were we discussing? Sorry.
We were talking about the quickening of time and the thinning of the veil and whether they're independent or a common causality.
Right. The issue is that the mind, as a subset of consciousness, is separate from the materium, but it's expressing itself through the materium. So the quickening of time and the separation of the veil or the thinning of it relative to our awareness are probably different sides of the same coin, so to speak. It's a multifaceted coin because there's a lot of other stuff going on. But the way I'm looking at it now, Terence McKenna was quite correct, and we're seeing a compression or coagulation, as the data has it, in time stuff coming into our universe, and we're repeating all of these patterns. So I guess it's really cool for Buddhists because once they see the patterns, they can step out of them and go on to the next level. But a lot of us are repeating stuff that we really could do without.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Hi, Clif. It's Lolly again.
Hello.
Hi. In contrast to what you've picked up in terms of the sheeple having a less willingness to know, on the forum, I've noted recently on the forum that the contemplation and involvement with your reports has brought about a recent shift in language and in reported experiences. Specifically, I've noted an increase in both the reporting and experiencing of psychic events, spiritual experiences, connections, and sync winks with each other, both on and off the forum. I see it as simply as an evolution of consciousness and more humans stumbling upon or actively seeking a better working knowledge of human potential, while at the same time disconnecting from illusory distractions, making different choices. So I'm wondering whether this trend is increasing and may in part contribute to the data wall that you're picking up. Can you talk about that?
I actually thought about that. One of the suppositions we had a couple of years back was that, maybe the data gap was a result of everybody actually getting into a point of becoming telepathic, and they just don't use the internet anymore, or psychicness became so common as to be not worth reporting, that kind of thing. And of course, that's still a semi-valid explanation. But if what you're experiencing at the level of the linguistics, though, is the same effect that you get as an individual, like when you buy a new car, all of a sudden you see nothing but that car everywhere. And it's that sensitization. Now, what people do with sensitization in terms of their awareness usually is that they let it fade and they go back to their old ways. What you have in the forum is a concentration of it, a crucible. And so basically it's like Jay Widener discusses, an initiatory process. And the reports, in a curious way, are not the gatekeeper, but the introduction to people taking an initiatory process to joining the crucible, where they will then be highly sensitized to what's going on, which further allows their awareness to focus on it. And then from that point on, they're given the option of developing it into a skill and mastering it, or not, as they should, and they in circumstances should choose. Make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm actually noticing a lot of people are actively working on developing those skills. So
yeah, that's kind of really freaky because I'm seeing that independent of our reports in all different kinds of places. And this is merely one example that happens to resonate with a small subset of the general populace as a whole, and we see the same kind of language that you guys express within your crucible. We see those archetypes showing up in the Russian, for instance, around the I can't think of the whole Cedars deal, and there's this other big dancer woman that has sparked something of an awareness phenomena in Russia as well. And so we're just seeing it pop up all over the place. I think of it as a way of universes balancing out against the fascism. Universe knows a giant wave of fascist repression is coming. It doesn't like that in a general sense because it's anti-balance. Fascism always leads towards extremes. And so it promotes its own method of getting rid of that in the sense of the counter wave already forming at the time that the fascism reaches its most powerful point. You know, that's the way it always is. Look at through history. Resistance is always just really getting organized and getting good just as the power reaches its pinnacle and is ready to topple anyway.
that makes sense. Okay.
I love that poem, by the way, Ozymandias, and its history in the various different versions. And they all come back to the same thing of, you know, statues in the sand being viewed from a distance. The cycles always repeat. So that part is relatively easy to forecast. We don't need much of the data. Again, I'd like to think that the fascism is really the cause of the data hole, because then it's within that environment, individuals will potentially thrive even if my particular system is shut down. Make sense?
Right. Yeah, I'd like to think that that's what the cause of the data wall is too, not the death of millions.
Correct.
Or some, yeah. Is it possible that the Schumann resonance of the Earth is impacted by some major event, thus creating major changes in the brain functioning of humans? I would suspect that such an event would also cause dramatic and abrupt changes in the functioning of the matrix as well, the failure of electrical grids. Do you think that's possible?
Certainly. Yeah. And in fact, it's the Schumann resonance is measuring crackling in the ionosphere, basically. So, it's certainly possible that it can be altered. I don't think it needs to be altered in order for there to be the changes in mental state, though. And I think that there are a great many energies around that we have no clue about that will be impacting our mental energies and getting us resonating in a whole lot of different ways that we will maybe interpret as mental illness, or may be so interpreted as mental illness by the social order that and the Schumann resonance could stay absolutely as it is. And yet let's not link them as to a necessary cause.
Okay.
And in fact, our data for years has been going on about the sun disease and people walking around, and not just disease of the sun, but the wider meme of disease here on Earth caused by the sun, disease here on Earth being promulgated, promoted, et cetera, grown by the sun, and including all the way up to people just walking across the street one day and then going into some kind of catatonic shock or state and sitting there drooling on their own shoes until someone comes and helps them out of the street. Not a good image, and the fact that we'd had it for so long has a tendency to make us think that its visible impact will be quite high, and we're entering that period now. That brings back that whole spectrum issue. You know, my little experiment with the sun here. I used to have a very sophisticated solar observatory that was somewhat annoying to my wife because it was a bunch of scientific crud lying around on the deck, some of rather dangerous, involving gnomon made out of spikes and stuff. But I studied the sun for a number of years locally, so I was prepared for all different kinds of things, and I've observed two large changes in it, one through the spectrum and one through a polarity filters experiment that I have set up. So if we want to go all the way back as a small diversion to people like Gurdjieff and the concept of the solar luneus, that while the moon affects us and makes us into lunatics on the night of the full moon, and there's all of the demonstrable evidence for that. He was of the opinion that the sun was far more powerful in its impact on humans, and that the cycles were much larger, and that's why we didn't see them coming in, that they would just come along and kick us in the butt and we'd all fall down. And I think we're in one of those particular periods at the moment.
Okay. Now, do you think that a certain percentage of humans would have a real adaptive response to those incoming energies and the changes?
Sure.
Yeah.
It must be so, simply because of the diversity that humans betray already.
Okay, thanks so much.
We know,
Clif.
for instance, that 2% of the people cannot help themselves. They must believe in God, no matter what, because they've got the gene for it. 6% of the population
Sorry, Clif,
is
you're dropping out.
electromagnetically
Clif,
sensitive.
we've lost you, Clif. We've lost you.
Hello? Hello?
Didn't hear that last bit.
Yeah, the interruptions came in again. Still with me?
Yep.
Okay, then here's what I was saying. 2% of the population is known to have a gene structure that forces them to believe in a God and a power structure. 6% of the population of humans is known to be electromagnetically sensitive. 3% is known to be highly sensitive to the upper range of those electromagnetism in the form of they always get cancers when exposed to microwaves. Some 11% is some degree chemically sensitive, and so on and so on. So there's no reason to suppose that there is not a group that is in a gene group that will be adaptive to what we've got coming to us. Now, curiously, there was another thing that we discussed with Mel about the skin disease for children that shows up drawing pictures on their bodies, as well as this group of individuals that will arise as planetary healers, if you will, over these next few months, and that these individuals somehow have a unique relationship with the new solar light we've got. There were indications within the Global Pop, the little tiny bit I happened to read through a cross-link in the Space Goat Farts about these guys having a relationship with blue light that offers this concentrated or condensed to compressed healing sort of thing, and that we'll see them emerge relative to the children with this skin disease that actually read something like a nasty plague. Again, all of it going back to the idea of the multiple dimensionality of the language around the idea of the sun disease. So not only will we see the grander, grosser effects within the sun itself, but all the way down to the microcosm, because it cannot be otherwise. We're all sharing the same vibratory experience within the same materium. And the description of the matrix I find to be very limiting, because it assumes that there's a grander universe beyond the matrix, and really there isn't. It's only existent at the level of vibration, and to believe otherwise limits your view of what's actually going on, I think.
Thanks, Clif.
Hi, Clif. Doris here from Vienna, Austria.
Oh, how are you doing? Guten
yeah.
Tag? No, Guten Abend.
Yeah, servus. I'm now switching the topic a bit to alien war memes. The alien wars has been a set of linguistics that have been in your data for a very long time. I believe 2002 or 3. Lots
Correct.
of movies
Correct.
out about aliens and alien invasions currently. We have also spoken to Joseph Farrell about ancient cosmic wars and Stan Deu and the Nephilim. Since your last run and with how reality is manifesting around us today, could you please give us your opinion on, or speculation on how you believe the alien wars linguistics will manifest in reality when it reaches its near-term peak in October?
I'm of the opinion that the manifestation in the language will create in the mainstream media images that we will see as local farmers with shotguns right next to their door, and their wives and children in the house at night out of fear of having to deal with pesky aliens. Now, the language has always described it thus. It, of course, doesn't tell us whether that's just how people are made to think, or in fact if that's really what's going on, and there's incident after incident of this occurring where people actually have to shoot at the aliens and so on. But the imagery coming through has remained relatively stable and growing over all of these years. So that's still what I'm expecting. I actually am sitting here waiting for a TV story or a news story to appear on a cable channel in which a farmer in typical farmer gear will be shown with a shotgun that he uses to defend his family at night from the aliens that we all know are causing such problems. So that's how I expect it to come in, and that's going to be something of a cultural shock, I think. And we're, by the way, getting the word shock repeatedly throughout the various entities, not only in the markets entity. That's why it was so tedious, actually, to do this last report that got all consumed. Not only was it the larger amount of immediacy data, but once we got through the filtering and got into the market stuff, there were just so many cross-links back to all of the other entities that it was just really slow going. Every single stair, for instance, had its own door going off in some side area that we had to pursue in order to really know what that stair was all about. And so it became very tedious to do so, and wherever we went, we ran into the shock word, including in the Space Goat Farts, including in the Alien Wars subset, as though the sheeple will be getting many shocks this year around that language set. Again, the peak on all of this appears to be coincident with the Terra entity causing emotional ramp up from fall through into winter of the Northern Hemisphere this year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is Lua again, Clif. MBJ Johnson from the forum has asked a question here, and it's please tell us more about the aliens and whether they're being herded by the powers that be. Are they already among us or coming soon? And her question is, the enemy of my enemy, a friend? Are we being studied or invaded? Do you have any ideas about this?
Well, I've got a lot of them. I don't know that any of them are coherent or cogent. The data is necessarily reflective of a wide range of opinion, and we even see data archetypes in which there's a legitimate opinion held, probably cultured over time, that all of this is a bunch of woo-woo and hoodoo and so on, and not to be taken seriously. Now, on the other end of things, though, there is demonstrable evidence in my own life that things ain't right out there. I mean, I've had stuff cut out of me that clearly was not organic. And we had a missing time episode, and we saw a UFO. Now, whether the UFO was in fact a giant triangular thing and we were messed with by a combined military alien hybriding scheme or whatever, I don't know, but I do not fit the same kind of pattern as most of the alien abduction kind of scenarios, in the sense that I don't have repeated instances of that, but my life experience does not fit within the larger parameters that guide those kind of things. So, for instance, if you go and you look at the abduction scenario, you find a certain set of demographics that apply. And usually the abductions do not occur outside of those demographics when they fit the standard abduction scenario. There are those rare instances of where the guy gets zapped up by a light beam off of his canoe in the middle of the lake, but those are extremely rare, and most of them, in fact, fit this particular pattern of on the road or out of the house, this kind of thing, and the life experiences of those people match a certain, let's just say, generalized sheeple profile that my life experience does not fit, and so it is not a curiosity to me that we only had the one episode. In other words, they might want to look at me once, but I didn't fit within the rest of their parameters, so there was no reason for them to pursue me beyond that point. So I know that the reality of manifesting universe in which my body exists also contains within it stuff that is officially denied as being space alien abductions, and I take as literal truth anything the government goes to the trouble of officially denying.
Absolutely.
So they've therefore qualified my experience, and they're saying they've never officially denied the military is out abducting people and making it look like space aliens, but they have officially denied that abductions have ever taken place. So you get to that level of understanding of it. They're out there. When are they coming here in terms of when is there going to be an out-and-out disclosure? Who the hell knows? I don't think it's under the control of the powers that be. I think that they're afraid of that as they're afraid of anything else that introduces instability, and that introduces instability at a level that they could not possibly hope to contain or control. So they're going to fight tooth and nail to prevent it from occurring. Look at the amount of energy they put into ridicule and everything else around the just seeing a space alien fly by, let alone sitting down and having pie with one. So I don't suspect that they will take it easily or kindly, and I think it's occurring now. And if you were to ask yourself, how do you transition a population of what you think may be intelligent beings out of a state of being studied into a eventual cooperative partnership? You'd have to do it gently, you know. If, for instance, we were studying an ant colony and we thought, for instance, that we saw signs of intelligence, before we intruded on those ants, if we were wise-thinking individuals, we would figure out a way to do it so that, you know, we would announce our presence. And we see examples of that in a lot of the, curiously, in a lot of the cultural traditions. So I find it very interesting that the Swahili tradition of somebody visiting another tribe is that they would go and stand, if they're unknown to that tribe, they would go and stand at what basically you and I would consider to be the personal space expanse of the tribal community. They'd stand at what would be the boundary layer at which the tribe maintained its local environment and wait to be noticed and recognized. That's also found in the non-tribal but sort of tribal communities of the Scandinavians. Approaching a new group, they would just simply stand there and let themselves, even if it took days, let themselves be noticed rather than affront them with their presence and co-opt in themselves into that process. They just allowed nature to take its course. We don't do that anymore because we're time pressed and time is mechanistic and you've got to go as soon as the next time clicks. But a space alien group might decide that the best way to do it is to take a couple of centuries and gradually show themselves here, there, and around and let the myth build up and do things in a very slow, progressive state. And we may again be close to some level of understanding or generalized understanding. I had this debate for a while with George Ure and maybe Jay Widener. I don't know if we involved him in it or not, but the discussion was around the idea that I'd had that, oh, well, maybe the data wall that we were going to hit was due to the disclosure, after which anything we did was pre-disclosure, and we were no longer the same group after that. And that would be the best of all outcomes, I think, is that data wall is actually a whole series of, the holes are actually a whole series of planned intrusions into our consciousness of other beings, and then all of a sudden they come down and say, hi, y'all.
You know, it's interesting to hear your response because it sounds to me like your experience matches mine exactly. Is it like missing time and only one time and that kind of thing? So, and also my life being completely not one of the sheeple, you know? Yeah,
and see, so those kind of things, and yet you find that specific family groups are repeatedly harassed and
right,
the various members, you know, and the genetics. And then you look at the demographics. I was involved in this giant computer study that the federal government ran in the early 70s when I was looking for work. And I managed this group of people, and we coded all of these records for the state of Washington and gave them to the feds. I didn't know I was participating in an evil act at the time, and I just needed the work. Anyway, so one thing that it taught me, though, was that you can take a collection of attributes, and it's very meaningful when that collection of attributes gets as large as possible, and yet you still find those that are outside of that collective. So, in essence, it reinforces the pattern. The outliers themselves tell you have an active pattern underway. So, for instance, I've run across other individuals like myself that have had the one-time experience, and they have, you know, 1 or 2 implants, and that's it. Cut them out, and they're never again. Other people I've run into have had the implants cut out and then new ones put back in.
Yeah.
So, they were in a cycle there, and obviously we're under continuing surveillance. I used to think it was because I had big dogs that slept on the bed, it discouraged that kind of a deal. But I don't know.
I'm deeply grateful that I'm in the not in that category,
Yes, yes.
I have another, on a slightly different subject here, another question from a forum member, Jean C. 1976. She's asking, there have been numerous prison breaks and releases throughout the planet since the global revolution started heating up last January. As a result, do you expect Cousin Alexei to show up soon? And what characteristics would make him stand out to us Terran humans?
There will be something in let's take the latter part first.
Okay.
There's going to be something in the actual video production quality that will make him stand out. Okay, so it's not going to be that he's bald or that he's got green ears or yellow eyes necessarily. It may be that there are visible energy waves rippling through the video off of him in a visual, in a way that's captured by the video process, the tubes themselves, or the CCC devices. So our indication was it was a technical capture, and otherwise he might be relatively unremarkable.
Mm-hmm.
The soon business is very interesting because the assumption was it would be after the solstice and before the equinox this year that's going to occur. And it may also be that is that's coincident with the increasing data holes, and it's also interesting that it may be perfectly timed for the powers that be to use as part of the overall movement of and distraction of us away from the soon-to-come misery over food, etc., in September, October. And so we don't know yet if they'll attempt to capitalize once it becomes something of a viral deal. And personally, I can't wait to see it. I'm just going to be thrilled. This is just going to be fantastic. It'll be one of the few bot hits, should it manifest, that are worth having, because most of them, are quite depressing.
Absolutely. Do you need to take a break and get a glass of water?
I've got some. It doesn't really help. We've got all kinds of activity going on here. It's dusty. It's reasonably hot. And I can't open the window, or otherwise we're going to have a lot of diesel fumes from the truck as they move the boat.
Oh, okay. This is a very different. Well, it's maybe the same subject. Elenin. Something is coming. You've talked about a body coming in that might be intelligently guided. NASA's talking about a comet. Others say it's a dwarf or a brown dwarf or a planet. The reports that you wrote about sounded to me like there might be a large spaceship coming in. Can you shed some light on this? Is it both of them? Is it nothing? And this was from MBJ Johnson on the forum.
Yeah, it's not the Elenin is not the object that NASA and the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese and the Hindus are now tracking coming in, because the object that they're aware of, and apparently have been for some huge amount of time, maybe 60 years or more, is coming in at 45 degrees to the pole, to the angle of the pole of our solar system. So Elenin is coming in along the ecliptic plane and intermixing with the planets. Its arrival is this year. The larger mass that may indeed be 3 discrete objects, which is now what appears to be coming out of the Russian literature, and thus 3 large, Colosseum-sized spaceships. That won't be here until probably sometime, coincidentally, in the late 2012, early 2013. I don't know if they're self-censoring or what, but there's not a lot of discussion about the arrival date. There is some discussion that suggests that the arrival date is questionable because of the very reason that they suspect that this object is intelligently controlled, and that is that it has slowed its apparent movement relative to our solar system, which is a pretty good indicator that, it's not your random space junk just gaining speed and whizzing along. It has actually apparently slowed a number of times in the last 60 years. So they can estimate, but if it slows again, that throws off the estimate. So they just don't know when it'll show up here. The Elenin thing is curious because of all of the language that's being all of the energy that's being put into the language in a deterministic fashion. there's two ways that values, the emotional values like duration or intensity or impact or any of these others that we track can show up. One is in a deterministic fashion where the value has been hyped, where you would actually, like in a real-time face-to-face meeting, you would raise your voice and make your face fierce and sort of yell. Okay, you're adding intensity to it in a deterministic fashion to whatever the discussion is. That is what is apparently going on in the LNN discussion, because every time it appears to die down a little bit, we have the same level of pumping coming in relative to emotional values around the subject within the language. It's a curious trend that we've been watching manifest along with a number of other curious trends. Kathy may have sent the message to Daniel about to remind me about Tavistock, but I'll discuss that now because it's somewhat related. I think it indeed may be perfectly related, but we don't have definitive proof of that just at the moment. But I say that it's somewhat related. It has the same characteristics of what we're seeing around the certain Wuzhou personalities. And I won't go into who the personalities are, but let me just state that we've noticed a weird pattern show up where in the top 10 conspiracy sites, and I won't go into how we define the top 10, but let's just say that one of the criteria would be that they're within the top 50 in terms of traffic. But within those top 10 conspiracy sites, we will see a weird pattern. And we'll see a pattern about, let's pick somebody, like let's just say that George Carlin was still alive. I respect him very much, and he was sort of a woo-woo guy, okay? Let's say he was still alive. What we would see if they were going to do it to him is that a post would appear that was 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years old in its origination, that had no activity on it in like the last 2 years, and all of a sudden has some new threads put on it, and the whole post is resurrected, and it had a rather inflammatory title. George Carlin spoke rudely to ducks. and or something really outrageous, something that's going to get your attention. And some of them are just George Carlin threatens to marry a black man. That's the kind of intensity they're putting into the title. So they get you with the title, and then it goes over and over and over again. We've seen these patterns show up 2 weeks before the sites around, for instance, George Carlin would be attacked. So there is this relationship between these posts, the way in which the intensity of the language is being manipulated, and the subsequent follow-on to actual denial of service attacks, hacking on their machines, and so on. And in this case, I'm seeing some of the same kind of deterministic language manipulation around the LNN thread, so I don't know what to think. I don't have any clear indication that it's not a big PSYOP deal. If there is a grain of truth to some of the worries about it, it's certainly buried in all the PSYOPs deal. That may be quite deliberate so that we don't get worried. When you get into that, whole pattern of paranoid thinking that eventually leads you to chew your mustache off and name yourself Igor. Mm-hmm. So that's the best I can do.
Okay.
But it is curious that they're pumping it, that there's a lot of and it's going in a wave form. So at the moment, I'm not personally worried about that, but I've always had a thing with George Ure that we would never know the truly exogenic event that's going to take us out as a species because we couldn't psychically know that the giant comet was on us until it actually hit us, that sort of a deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. It's been an honor to speak with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to ask questions on behalf of forum members. So thank you very much.
Sure, yeah, no problem. Glad I can do it.
Hi, Thuras here again. I would like to switch or to come back to the markets entity.
Sure.
It seems like the reports were off a year, at least in some topics. So comparing to the ineffective protests of last year, those starting in Greece and Spain at the moment seem more like so-called real thing. But in general, worldwide public unrest is still brewing without real backlash for the powers that were. Would you say that there's a lag in the web boards, or is this deviation of the data a result of the bots exaggerating things? And what are you seeing in the near-term economic future for the EU and the US in detail?
The issue is more my level of interpretation. As I look through that little pinhole at the aquarium, I have to choose some level of focus that might be limiting, and so we cannot tell when looking at a bunch of colored dots within model space the depth of those dots and whether we're looking at the hard end of a cone or looking at a tube. And so I would agree that that the apparent reception of the language would say we were off by a year with some of this, but I would dispute that and say that indeed what happened was the narrow tip of the cone appeared just as we forecast, but we just didn't have any idea as to how wide the tip would evolve into how wide of a cone it would evolve, and that we're still in that cone and that stuff is still evolving. And so I would also agree that you're quite correct. It does feel as though it's not yet manifest as it had been described, but nonetheless, I think we sort of hit it in that it started when we said it would, and it's shaping up linguistically the way that we said it would, and it's all actually getting right into this latest report. That was what struck me so much, was the sudden appearance, if you will, after going through all of the immediacy data of the shorter term data around the US dollar and the economic problems that will strike first in the EU, leading to the social problems that will then come back all the way to the US, and it's the shock and the fracturing. It's as though we're in a time when the language is metaphorically operating at a fractal level beyond my ability to really grasp. But, for instance, we have an expanding Earth, which is clearly fracturing and demonstrating fracturing, at the same time that we have our civilization fracturing all the hell and gone, at the same time that the supports for the dollar fracture, et cetera, as opposed to, a nice peaceful time of civilization, and then the Earth decides to fracture. So it's just, ironic that we're going through it at a species level in all of our social institutions, just as the planet decides it's also going through it.
Okay, so a follow-up question I would like to ask from the forum member MTY. You mentioned the Irish and the feet earlier in the year. Do the Irish walk from the euro currency, or maybe the Greek?
I think I actually don't know that they'll be singular in that regard. I think the Irish may be the linchpin that actually pulls the when they pull out, we see the fracturing, and that's why they're important. The fracturing may be occurring anyway. It probably is occurring. The recent, shall we say, social unrest, social order disruptions occurring in southern Europe will spread north. It may be that the Irish are important because that when the social unrest finally hits them with better weather here, then maybe it's at a pivotal point temporarily, and from that point on everything really crumbles, as opposed to them being causal. Make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. But the Irish, by the way, is a temporal marker. When they take whatever action it is that they're going to take relative to the debt, it will be visible enough that as a temporal marker, I'm personally using that as my counter for the number of weeks before the euro itself collapses. And I'm figuring that it'll be about 3 weeks based on how the language itself shaped up, immediacy values relative to shorter term. And so then I think it'll maybe as long as 3 months before the dollar collapses, but it may be as short as 3 weeks after the euro goes. And I think the currency will go before the social order totally breaks down and everybody starts creating their own currencies, which forces everybody back into nationalism.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, Clif, funny you were talking about Tavistock. Fox, the admin, had a question in regards to, it's been said that Tavistock is the best kept secret in America, and that all Tavistock and American Foundation techniques have a single goal: to break down the psychological strength of the individual and render him helpless to oppose the dictators of the world order. It appears to me that this is pervading almost every facet of the internet as well as mainstream media. Is there anything you could tell us regarding Tavistock?
There's some things that probably are easily found out. There's some things that I think I know about it. There may be some. Let me put it this way, okay? Without seeming mysterious or trying to hide things, there's just areas that it's just simply not wise for me at this particular point in time to pursue because I don't want to deal with it now. I've got other crap going on, and so I just don't want to invite trouble to come and kick me in that particular direction. So I won't go into explicit detail on this. However, we can certainly say that there's no dispute in my mind with any of the statements you've made about Tavistock, and there's no dispute in my mind that Tavistock's presence and profile is certainly worth keeping your eyes focused on. And you'll see some real changes in that, I think, relatively soon. Again, after the upcoming solstice.
Fantastic. Clif, it's close to the 2-hour mark, and I just wanted to check if you wanted to see if your
Sure. So far we're good. There's been no real crisis, and the boat and the truck are both at the very end of the driveway, and they appear to be doing the cleanup process to getting themselves safely out of here. And I wish them the best of luck because this was the easy part of it all.
Okay.
But so I'm good to go. We can keep going. I'll let you know if things intrude here.
Okay, we just need to maybe 2 minutes to wrap up if you need to go. Okay. Okay, we'll continue on with Lolly.
Well, hi, Clif.
Hello?
We've acknowledged the link between consciousness and the material world, and I've often wondered if you make a very strategic use of your reports, where you go beyond just reporting the data to selecting what you will and will not include in the reports, to make use of that principle. Can you comment on that?
I do that. I mean, there's no question on that. Okay, I do that. I have my reasons for doing that. I usually state them flat out in the sense that I don't want to encourage people who irritate me, and I don't want to report at some level when I know my reporting is causing a response that ripples back to me through the data. I don't want to do that simply because it's a pain to thereafter filter that out and take it into account. So I do that. It's primarily so far it's with like the powers that be entity, which I finally dropped because I was getting to the point where there was no safe language I could report on around it that wouldn't cause a level of problems either for our reports, us personally, people associated with us, or give encouragement to them in the sense of being allowing them to know that this particular plan was being exposed at this level, and therefore they could abandon it ahead of investing that energy. Because I think it's necessary that they fail on their own without me saying that this could be a failure ahead of time. I don't, for instance, do any of this. I've never used this stuff potentially to enrich myself or any of that kind of crap or take revenge on enemies or any of that sort of weird stuff at a personal level, except for one time, and that was when I used it to sell all of our stock just before the crash in 2000, I sold all of our 44 shares, and we got out clean at the peak of the markets then. And I knew it was coming, but at the same time, I was telling everybody, "Hey, look at this interesting thing that's going to happen real quick." And nobody really listened. And then my wife beat the crap out of me for a week, saying, "Oh no, it's all going to recover and stuff." And then finally, she did agree that maybe my timing was okay. Which was decent of her because it was it was not a good thing I did in how I did it because I knew it was coming. I set certain limits. She was not really aware of why I set the limits. They weren't pertinent at the time. And then when they triggered, it was as though I had moved unilaterally. And you just don't do that when you're married or she beats the crap out of you.
Okay. Well, we've had a great discussion on the forum. In the last report, you used the word holes, and you said I'm intentionally using it. I think so.
Correct.
Can you fill us in on some of those holes now, or are those still in play?
They're still in a position to where there were two of the areas that I was going to discuss in this last report that may yet be discussed in the report out in early July, but I don't know for sure until I get back into the data. So I'll leave those two aside. But the holes are still a marker that they should be self-filling, so to speak, in the sense that we'll see the words around the hole manifest, and then we'll see a causal thing, and somebody might say, oh, aha, he wasn't saying that John Edwards was going to commit suicide due to the horror of the perp walk, okay? He didn't say that, the owner of the tabloid that had started this whole meme would be arrested and blah, 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 blah. But at the time, the prominent suicide and this kind of thing, it will be filled in by the personages involved. So in that sense, as I say, the whole should be self-filling, and we really shouldn't need to go into them. The exception being that the holes relative to market activity, because there's a lot of information going on there, and a lot of it, quite frankly, is leaking out through idiots that assume their communications are more or less private, and they're involved in investigations and stuff. And it just gets reported and reported and repeated, and we pick it up eventually. And so I don't want to go into any of that kind of stuff because of the very real potential of it being used as a point of liability against me.
Okay, thanks. Now, you've talked about the timing of your reports and using the metaphor of a funnel, but it seemed to me that over the last 2 or 3 years on the forum and reading your reports that it's been somewhat helpful to be able to take apart the layers and see what's going to happen, because it's all sort of happening now. So it's been helpful as a forum member and a reader of your reports to contemplate in advance some of the things that you saw happening, say, a year ago, but it's all happening
showing up
now.
Today.
Yeah.
Makes one very calm in a sense. Yeah. It's, well, I appreciate, thanks for noticing as the politically correct response to that. And indeed, it's also very heartfelt. Thank you for noticing that it aids you to know this ahead of time and just go,
Mm-hmm. Was that strategic on your part?
Oh, sure. That's the whole point of this.
That's the whole point.
And it can be revealed at this point because I don't know how we're all going to end up here. But, my whole point was way back when, in the progression of my brother's illness as a terminal patient there, I got to the understanding that it was not necessary, that he need not have suffered as he had, and that a great deal of his suffering was quite deliberately engineered, although not specifically focused at him. It was just generally applied by the powers that be. So I got really upset with these guys, and I had come to an awareness that they existed, and mostly I didn't care because, for instance, the smart individual could harmonize with them and bet with the Fed, as the markets say, and you could have done all right. But they really irritated me with what my brother went through, and it was totally unnecessary. So I determined that, there must be an asymmetric response in which I, as the flea on the dog, can cause some problems. At the very least, get back a little bit of irritation, along with our, now reasonably famous motto of "I am the dog who gnaws his bone, I sit here and gnaw it all alone. The day will come which is not yet, when I will bite him by whom I'm bit." And so going along that route, I thought, how could I, as a single individual with a few smarts, do something that would have an effect totally out of proportion to my resources, that would spread throughout the planet, that would cause some real irritation to these bastards. And well, this is how you do it.
And okay.
So you see, and it's like, at this point, it doesn't matter anymore. They know what I'm doing, and they've taken action over this last year to let me know that they know what I'm doing and that they're aware of this. And so it's not like it's a big secret anymore. And the way you do that is you cause those ripples to go out by preloading things in people's minds, such that basically everybody who's ever read the report and then had an aha moment when something has happened is also forced to contend with the obvious question that thereafter arises. If it could thus be seen ahead of time, was it all planned?
Okay. I don't know what to say.
It's sort of my little joke with universe, yeah. And it also goes back to what Lao Tzu said. And Lao Tzu, he was the guy who had 3 great treasures, but he also had a couple of other really good understandings. And the understandings are that he who is captured by desire can see only the manifestation. And she who frees herself from the desire can see only the mystery. And then he goes further to say that the true function of a Taoist, that is to say, someone on the path who's attained some level of skill, is to do the small thing that causes the action at a great distance. And in the way that he phrased it, was by saying a word that would resonate 1,000 li, in their version of a mile. And it's curious, of course, that he was very linguistically focused, and a lot of the references within the Taoist tradition are all about linguistics. And we get back to where we are today. And it's just been gratifying that indeed it's possible to change reality, sitting on your butt in the woods, with a computer, in a gentle fashion, without being deliberately malicious and also, in a deliberate attempt to harmonize with universe. And geez, anybody could do it.
Sorry, Lolly, just a quick one. So you're counter-influencing the negative effects of the powers that were with your own memering. Is that what you're trying to say as well?
I'm saying that the language that I choose, in a sense, you're correct. Okay, but I'm not doing it online in the sense of memering in terms of discussion groups and so on, right? My memering is being done with the language that I include in the reports, causes, in a Jay Widener kind of a parlance, an initiatory response and a series of necessary questions that follow. Bear in mind that the whole path to alchemy, to secret knowledge, to dojos, to any of this kind of stuff is all built around questioning. And you basically ask and answer your questions over and over and over again, and you get to the point where you get a real grasp of reality through the questioning process, what they called Socratic method in Greece, and, the Zen koans and all of this kind of a deal. So language is itself very powerful, and it causes neural networks within the brain to fire off in specific ways. And so it is possible to choose to use specific kinds of language, as you see Buddhists do frequently, that will cause certain levels of resonance to occur, in essence, as a wave to be propagated or as a counter wave. And so I saw what the powers that be were doing with all of their spin and language and so on, and I decided that way back when, that okay, I have a couple of really good ideas about this. Universe has provided me with certain sets of skills. I can use language effectively, and so I will use their tool against them, since they're really like using language, and no one else I'd seen was taking this particular approach. And so I decided I would Aikido them with the feather moving the 10,000 pound attack, by knowing exactly what they were going to do ahead of time with the language, and, if you will, spoiling the field by spooking the game early.
And then sort of like knowing the answer about the question that you're about to ask type thing.
Correct. And it was a deliberate, thing that I need to apologize to everybody who's ever read my reports, because in essence I was intruding on their mental space. I do it as any other artist. Artists, by definition, really are people who tell lies in order to reveal the truth, through causing emotions to change. Quite the reverse of politicians, who use lies to obscure the truth by causing emotions to change. And so, as a true artist, it was my goal to use my martial art at whatever level I could. And so I used the language within the reports to cause people to think about things in specific ways. But that's no different than any other author. It's just that I had very deliberate processes that I wished to, and paths that I wished to expose in the language in a meaningful, conscious fashion as we went along, and do so to this day, whereas other authors may be more organic in it and just may flow with it, and the language may come tumbling out from them.
I did have the sense of that, Clif, beginning in last fall in some of the articles that you wrote. So I sort of caught that, woke up to that intention, and began to harmonize, as you say, with some of what you wrote. So while you might have had a specific intention to disturb the medium for the powers that be, I think what I've also been aware of is that it has been quite a good thing as I look on the forum and engage in that activity. For myself, it's been a good thing. Some of the things that you've written about, the article on the Tao of Humanity, that one really touched me, that ending of the last report.
Well, I'm very pleased that it did. I'm doing each and every one of these as though it's the last one I'll ever do, which is why the level of intensity seems to have ratcheted up. Excuse me a second. We've got coughing in the throat that had to come out. Still there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay. So it pleases me that people catch this because it almost violates the process to ask. Make sense?
To ask you?
No, for me to ask if, hey, anybody catching what I'm doing here? You know?
Right. I got it. Okay.
Because part of the initiatory process is that the initiate in the martial arts must overcome each plateau on their own and reach this point of discovery, which is climbing up the appropriate cliff to reach to the next plateau, and so on and so on. And really, you kind of violate the process itself because by bringing the whole discussion of the process up to the initiate, because basically you're supposed to start out in a unaware mind, and it's when you recognize that you're part of the process that you obtain that big leap in real understanding and enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. So in combination with that bit of your report, in the article you wrote on shunning, where you said we're all dead.
Right. Which is quite true, yeah.
Well, it is true for us all, but I also read it as also more of a transformational experience, as in the death card of the tarot. That again, that's a initiatory experience, sort of reading that and processing your words on that. Can you share more on that article on shunning?
The whole thing about the shunning was basically an attempt to get people to understand the seriousness of the attack underway by the powers that be, seemingly in a very deliberate fashion, as opposed to through incompetency, and that they are quite deliberately attempting to isolate us and poison us within the band of the equator north to 50 north latitude. And that, there's no need to be violent about it. Just because they're idiots and they're violent and they wish to attack at a violent level doesn't mean we have to respond that way. In fact, given this particular set of idiots, it's wise not to respond that way because they're very good at violence and handling it, categorizing it, labeling it, getting others to dismiss it, and then dealing with the perpetrators. As we see them do repeatedly. This is the whole message, is that you get out of line and we'll crush you. Now, usually that if you get out of line, we'll crush you thing is a subtle message that's been directed outward from the United States. That message is going to very soon be directed inwardly, and that'll be the breakout into fascism. Maybe. The problem is that they're erasing a series of circumstances, as are we all, that are manifesting all around us and are basically all really interrelated, where they're starting to exacerbate each other in what I'm thinking is going to be a really grand systemic meltdown. So will the powers that be succeed? Will they be able to engineer us into their particular agenda? Which includes, is they've left many groups of evidence the death of a great number of us, and the evidence includes, releasing the plutonium, the BP, the planetary global warming thing, all of it, all of the power elite moving to the underground shelters in South America, the change in the southern hemisphere in terms of the political control and how it's all going. The evidence abounds. The seed vault in the northern hemisphere, as though we're all going to be wiped out, and later on when the powers that be return, they'll need to get some seeds, and there they are all nice and stored and kept cold for them. See, the seed vault never made a lot of sense to me relative to a natural disaster such as a crustal shift, but it does under the current scenario where they're going to kill us all off quietly without a whole lot of damage to the planet. Will there be a World War III in that regard? Will we end up with that level of death, or is it going to be a transformational thing at the eschaton level, the way that Terence McKenna thought it might be? I don't know, and I don't know the one precludes the other. You can still have transformation of your consciousness as you leave Materium, even leaving this particular body. And we may be going through one of those kind of events where a great number of us will choose not to reincarnate for whatever reason. And that kind of thing is certainly within what McKenna was talking about in the compression of the time that we've got. The shunning article was specifically focused on the idea that an action needs to have a response. A violent action need not have a violent response, but by not responding, not only are we at a surface level encouraging further violent responses, but by not responding, we're not generating any of the counter waves that will be necessary for future actions that they're going to take. So they can, at this point, because there's not been a huge global outcry and a rushing of people into Japan to pour boron onto the reactor, and a heroic effort the way they did in Chernobyl, at that national level, they can assume that we'll be compliant, that the sheeple will be compliant the next time they set off a whole slew of these things in whatever their next adventure is, which may be New Madrid. And so there's a lot of nuke plants that will be affected if the New Madrid earthquake goes, and it's of a severity to cause infrastructure disruption. And those nuke plants will further exacerbate the whole situation between the boundary of the equator and 50 North. The jet stream now appears to be isolating 50 North, so we may yet see that there's an actual physical manifestation of that. And if the powers that be have their way, I'm quite certain that now is the time that they want to have us all depart in a great, huge mass. And the reasoning behind it is kind of the following. Whether you think we're a prison planet or anything along those lines, we're a finite set of resources, and their management style is such that we're consuming more resources than exist. And we've reached the point where we're about to have an ecological crash. It's easier for them to deal with us if there's fewer of us during that period of time, because necessarily there will end up being few of us. And they just don't want to have us take them out on our way down, so to speak. And that's my current understanding of how things are unfolding.
Okay. Was the data picking up, or in your latest run, anything happening in the New Madrid zone?
That was the part of the thing that made the markets entity extremely intriguing, was that in the previous Shake report, we discussed a financially shaking earthquake, an earthquake that changed the international arrangement relative to currency. Whatever that may be, I don't know. And that's showing up within the markets entity this last time in the report that got eaten, and it was part of the 9 pages I'd done so far relative to that. And I don't know how many pages would have been devoted to the market entity. It was so large relative to to its previous size. But yes, there was indication of that earthquake manifesting within the period of time after the solstice. So theoretically within our summer, because we're looking at a cone, we can't really tell. The earthquake information I'm always reminded of the situation with the Sumatran tsunami, where we had earthquake information that was all jumbled up, and it was basically the description for the earthquake that struck the Scott Peterson trial in California was jumbled up in the information that came out that was also describing the Sumatran earthquake. So when the Scott Peterson trial happened and some of the language manifest, we thought at that time, oh, that was it. The whole earthquake had happened and we were done with it. And then later on, some 6 months later, the Sumatran earthquake happens and the rest of the language was fulfilled. That just sort of give you an idea of what the effect of looking through the cone can be. So we don't know yet if that's, again, the same kind of situation relative to the earthquake. We have data showing that there's an earthquake that's going to show up after the solstice, maybe very soon after the solstice, so end of June, that is going to be disruptive to the international currencies. Now, is this going to be a big New Madrid kind of thing that's going to hit us at that level? I don't know. It may just be something that's a strategic quake somehow that is a prelude, and maybe some months later then we'll get hit with a larger quake. There's some indication within the data set before it got eaten up that we were again looking at that Scott Peterson and Sumatran tsunami kind of a cone developing. So that's kind of why I think, there's a New Madrid stuff showing up, but there may be a significant earthquake ahead of that.
Okay. So along with these possibilities, whether it's the New Madrid or some other location in the U.S., and what you spoke of, the energies directed inwards towards the states now, you have previously mentioned the notion of American karma and spoken in the past with much emotion about what you've picked up in the data regarding the destruction of the people and your country, the U.S., and the aftermath of future events. It seems to me that we in the Western world have lived with such a sense of entitlement and that things should be so good, when so many in other parts of the world have suffered all along for that sense of entitlement, fueling the Anglo-American empire. We've supported these policies and actions in one way or another, even if only by apathy or silence. Can you offer or ignorance, right? Can you offer more of your insight into your understanding of these events? Like it or not, your words hold weight and measure to those of us who participated in your work.
I'm just a pie baker who fell into something and got really ticked off and started a project that's gotten totally out of hand, people.
Well, we'd still like to hear what you'd have, what you have to say at this point in time.
Well, it's curious you bring it up, because just today I had to drive into town, a relatively rarity kind of a thing for me. I've been doing more of that since I've got the crew here. But just today I was thinking about the ability of me to move my atoms through space at a level that is basically unknown outside of the Anglo-American Empire. And it's unknown through a wide variety of causes, but it is symptomatic. Our acceptance of and our ease of living with the idea that, I can drive my humongous El Gigantico vehicle here, and so what if I only get 20 miles to a gallon? And I'm thinking, okay, well, there's still some 4 billion people that don't have that freedom of movement on this planet. And that this level of I didn't think of it as in terms of the entitlement, but I thought of it in terms of the lack of the entitlement, in terms of the impact that has on the social order of those parts of the planet where walking is still the primary method of moving around. And it's a calorie versus machinery kind of a thing, which led again to another thought that American karma is about to go back to a period of time where the idea of someone driving an SUV from house to house to house in a rural environment to deliver a newspaper will be absurd, and that it will go back to the situation as had been described in the 2000 reports and 2001 and so on, of a calorie economy where the calories inherent in the diesel fuel to drive the SUV are so much more precious and harder to obtain than the calories that are necessary for a kid to pedal a bike, and we'll go back to almost that level of some component of our infrastructure. And it's occurring around us all over the place. We're having those levels of breakdowns that are going to force us back to that. So our karma is not instant by any mean, but it probably is at a civilization level, 200 plus years being a relatively short span of time. But we're about to get smacked really hard this year by karma, and you'll see the social order change around us, even down to the level of how newspapers are delivered and whether or not they continue to even exist at all, or the internet, that kind of thing, because there will be power levels and or power problems and shifts caused at all different kinds of levels within our social order.
So again, Clif, you would see this as a balancing.
The whole universe is all about that. Yeah. Look, you look at the metaphor. Anywhere you care to go, in any of the abstractions that humans place on their observation of universe, call it archaeology, oceanography, physics, any of it, you'll see that all of them are all about equations. Basically, they try and all reduce them to math, and all the equations come back to everything is cyclic, and everything is trying to find a nice harmonious balance from our viewpoint. And so we think of entropy as being negative and growth as being positive. And in one of our abstractions, it's linear, but we really do recognize that you can't have growth without destruction, and therefore it's all part of the same cycle, all bound up. And it's all inextricably glued together. One must, as a necessity, feel the pain of holding rage as one might hold a hot coal. In order to be able to transfer that pain to someone else, you've got to feel it first. So it's really, it must exist. That's just the way the universe is structured. In order for there to be me causing pain somewhere else, I must first experience it. So, George Bush, the future reformed cheerleader pedophile president of the United States, must have suffered greatly in order to be able to explode small frogs and take joy from it. And it was the universe at some level that is attempting to seek a balance of him trying to express that pain in exploding the small frogs, right? Now, he creates ripples out that the Buddhists would say probably should not have been gone out, and it'll come back in a karmic fashion. But nonetheless, even karma is its own way an attempt for universe to balance itself out. I think, of course, that even universe knows that achieving balance is, from our viewpoint, not a good thing. Because when everything was balanced, there would be no movement.
Right. Thanks very much for all of your thoughts, Clif. Thank you.
Hi, Clif. This is Gemini again.
Yeah.
You had touched lightly on in the interview about humanity not waking up and not wanting to know what is happening even as they're going off a cliff. Based on all of your research, has there ever been a time when humanity hasn't been controlled? And in your opinion, what do you think it will take for humans to truly evolve and either coexist with the powers that were, or to not even have the powers that were in our lifetimes and just existing, period?
I don't know what it'll take for us to get beyond them. I know that we can't really coexist with them anymore because it's a net, reducing everything to math again, it's a net negative game in the sense that until it's all concentrated, all the wealth, all the power is concentrated into extremely narrow hands, which is an extreme state. And so we must have an explosion or a tearing down from the outside in order to liberate that energy and spread it out in a balancing kind of an effect. So we won't live with the current crop of the powers that be for much longer. I don't know what the initiatory process or spark will be. It's really, I do believe there certainly is a point where humanity as a whole was not as controlled as it is now, although subsets were controlled in fierce ways, and they've demonstrated that to us. So, for instance, at the same time that we had a flowering of individualism in the Chinese sphere of influence, we had the Mayans in this huge, rigid reptile cult killing vast quantities of their own people in the mind control effort that if they only satisfied the reptile god's insatiable desire for blood, everything would be peace, light, and the birds would sing again. And so they were obviously controlled and really dominated by reptile thinking, and at the same time the Chinese were not. We don't see it as spreading around the populace globally at the same way at that particular time in humanity. But I would say that probably represented the last time that we were an organic species in a small sense, in the sense that we were not a homogeneously mind controlled. And you can no longer say that. I mean, the poor Chinese fellow laboring in an iPad factory where he has to sign a statement pledging not to suicide over the terrible conditions is every bit as mind controlled and suffered in the mind control from the same sources as somebody who's cube farmed in a Bank of America telemarketing center. And same as in an insurance cube farm, etc. So we're all now under a global system, And again, it's reached an extreme, and as all Taoists know, when any cycle reaches an extreme, the pendulum swings back the other way. So we're about to go back through, and we'll briefly arc through that little narrow part of balance before we go back to the other way. Will it require a smart species would recognize what's going on to itself as a species level and would alter its behavior to harmonize with universe, and so, say, would peacefully give up the powers that be in the hierarchical model and rapidly evolve itself into a state one civilization in which we had a fractal model of organization and education, and would go on from there. I don't know that we really qualify as a smart species and whether we'll apply that stuff to ourselves. But we could if we wanted. There's nothing stopping us. And
Sure.
this is the really weird part. Yes, we're at a resource limitation all around the planet. We've run into the fisheries resource limitation, the air limitation, water limitation, and so on and so on. But that limitation, as we've been told, is due only to the control structure that's been posed on us. If we didn't fish this way, fisheries are sustainable. If we didn't harvest lumber this way, lumber is sustainable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it is not a naturally occurring situation that brings our species to the edge of the petri dish under the current condition. It is a control structure that, so far as we can tell, did not exist in previous cycles. And I don't think will exist very much longer, to be honest. It's fracturing all over the place. Whether they're able to wrest control through the process of transformation is an open question.
Okay, so as the veil thins, you don't think that it's possible that we would start to awaken en masse?
I think that may be the case, but it may be too late at that point.
I see.
It may be too late already for the masses to awaken, because the next generation of humans genetically may be at this point being eliminated through radiation, and our species is probably not waking up to that effect. We've already suffered the infertility problems that go along with the predictable infertility problems that go along with the end of the sunspot cycle, and that really puts a lot of species at risk. So we're seeing a lot of the species extinction is a natural sort of the part of things, and I think the powers that be are simply using the feather against 10,000 pounds approach to first isolate the northern hemisphere atmospherically and oceanographically, and then pollute it until a certain percentage of us die, and that's probably a fairly high percentage.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean that any given individual will die sooner than their karma would allow. I mean, it gets really complicated when you start thinking about it at that level.
Right.
You're bringing in individual and collective karma. Nonetheless, there is a deliberate risk to us all that a sane individual in our species sitting here saying, the background radiation has gone up 30 times and shows no sign of reducing itself. This is not the way it is north of 50 or south of the equator. Maybe I'd better move. Really that would be the rational response, but we don't see it happening.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, there's been something that I've been pondering, and I'd like your thoughts on the process of reincarnation and death being another layer of illusion. When individuals like Daniel Brinkley, Betty Eades, and countless others have gone to the light and returned with experiences of seeing their families, their pets, etc., and they come back with messages for humanity, I think their experiences are credible, and I believe that they believe their experiences are credible. But I'm wondering if this, too, is another level of control and illusion, and until we spiritually break that cycle, we are bound to this planet or to keep reincarnating here. I personally have had recall of past lives, but reincarnation no longer makes sense to me. What are your thoughts regarding the ability to break through the reincarnation level or illusion so that we can ascend even further onto our soul's journey, whatever that may be?
Okay, it's my thoughts are on a couple of different levels. It's a very complex sort of a subject. So let's just look at the idea of reincarnation. How could I, if I die now, experience a contact with my father or my brother if both have previously died and have reincarnated as the many people assume occurs? Vast quantities, Buddhists, etc.
Right.
how would that be possible? Because theoretically they're already in some other body somewhere. Well,
Right.
having had an enlightenment experience that was typical as insofar as being described, with the blinding flash of light, instant connection to everybody and all of that kind of stuff, I know that there's a layer in this that goes back to the Jane idea of it is not either or, it is both and. So my brother both reincarnates and would be available to me in the greater consciousness should I die now. Because, for instance, the consciousness that you experience is not the sum total of the consciousness that you have. You have to think of the planets in the universe as I think of as the materium. And the materium is where we go to play our virtual games. So you exist outside of the materium in spite of the fact that you exist within the materium. And so if I were to look for my brother now, I might find that he had reincarnated with the Mongolian hordes because he always had a fascination with horses and wanted to work that out. Okay? But
Okay.
at the same time, if I died now, I could go, because the process of death is the removal of this little pseudopodia of consciousness within the materium, and that's all it is, I would go back out to the greater consciousness that I share with all other beings, and there would be that greater consciousness component of my brother. So I could indeed experience him that way. If I then came back into the illusionary world of the materium, I might, under those circumstances, think that, and it would make sense for me to perceive my experience of my brother as he was all there, because I experienced him as being all there, and so it would never occur to me that what I was experiencing was actually his greater whole, and that the part of him that I had lived with all these years in the materium had in fact gone off to live with a bunch of people in Mongolia and deal with horses. Make sense?
It does.
Okay, so now getting back to the idea of the whole transmigration of souls, I don't buy. Okay, because the transmigration of souls is part of the mind control effort that used to exist around the whole idea of reincarnation, that somehow your soul was a discrete entity like a paramecium, and it had its little rotifers out there, and it rotated around and would go from body to body to body. And my view does not express itself that way. I prefer to think of things in the reverse, that the bodies that we occupy here are in the materium for us to occupy, exist only for this particular purpose of us to have these experiences, and that the consciousness that is motivating this body cannot die, because it is part of the greater consciousness that is on the outside of and contributes to and creates the materium. And so it's very much like you're in a glove box, and when the hand is pulled out, the glove dies, but the hand isn't harmed or altered in any way by being extracted from the glove. And in fact, may have a rather pleasant experience that isn't quite so sweaty.
Okay. So anything that we could experience, we're experiencing perhaps all at once? Inside the materium and outside of it?
Okay, that is quite correct at many different levels. The materium, in and of its nature, is built in such a way that we experience things sequentially within how the mind of the glove cogitates about it.
Okay.
But that is only due to the way in which consciousness tries to deal with the materium itself from the greater sense outside it. So let's look at what's his name, Ian Lungold, in his great article on oh, geez, I can't think of the name of it now. Here it is, The Game of Loss.
Game of Lost Luck.
Correct. Just a great article that gives you a good perception of it. Now, what I do is I take his ideas expressed in that article, and I take them one step further. And I say that what he's talking about is the physical manifestation at a level we cannot perceive of a physical reality that is so fine that it eludes our senses, and that physical reality includes things like karma, good, bad, and indifferent. And that we can think of the materium not as a big square box, but like a round aquarium, and we're all inside this round aquarium, and pressed on the outside of the round aquarium all around us is the greater giant consciousness, of which we are a willing participant. And we are not in any way separated from the greater giant consciousness that we do not choose to experience. And it gets very much more complicated from there on. But basically, the reason that we reincarnate is to deal with the results of the actions that we set loose in the materium as part of the greater game that we can see a greater percentage of from our larger consciousness looking through the outer sphere of the materium down into its little core that we experience as the little consciousness.
Wow, okay. Do you ever think that we have the choice to not reincarnate here physically on planet Earth?
Sure, and we have the choice to reincarnate in a number of different ways. There's nothing to say that there isn't a reincarnation from your little consciousness that you're experiencing right now may decide that it needs to deal with its karma in a particular way as a platypus creature on another planet somewhere, and it's going to have a lovely time doing so. And it may be that it's a recreational thing, even for all I know.
Sure.
But there is nothing to say that doesn't occur. And in fact, those beings within the materium who've gone to the trouble of spending their lives to categorize all of this, including the Jain and the Taoist and so on, also point out in like the 6 yogas of I think his name is the 6 yogas would get it in a search of somebody. I can't think of his name at the moment. Have an email me going. But anyway, in those 6 yogas, they point out you don't have to reincarnate at all should you choose not to. And that here's what you're going to face when you die and you go through the bardo. And basically that's another layer of illusion to see if it can't trick you into dealing with your karma coming back into another body. But you need not. And that if you're willing to accept it and face it, then that's your choice at that point. And that's one of the things I will do at this point to see if I'm ready in the passing into this through this next veil of death, if I'm ready to try the non-corporeal dealing with karma. It's a real bitch. I mean, it's a reason for coming back and dealing with karma at a physical level.
Right. Okay. Very interesting.
If you really want to get into karma down to the point of the gnat's ass, pursue the Jain philosophy, and you'll eventually come along in contact with these with the German Jain people who, because they're Germanic, love to categorize, and they categorize the hell out of karma. And it makes a lot of sense the way they did so.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your response. The next question is from forum member Lauren. Several years ago on an interview you did the Mysteries of the Mind show, you recounted a bit of Eastern philosophy about a finite number of souls, which are split among the number of people on the earth. Eventually the souls must reconnect back to humans in the 1-to-1 ratio. I've never been able to track down this exact myth. Can you tell me where this came from, or perhaps tell it again with more detail?
It's not a myth. It was a paraphrasing of an understanding that's expressed both by the Buddhist and the what's known as the big raft Buddhists, as opposed to small raft Buddhism, which leads to Vipassana and so on. And it was expressed by the Buddhist and by the Tibetan. I can't think of. They're not really Buddhists, but the distinction is lost on most people. But they're Tibetan, and I have one of them. One of the discussions comes from a book by a guy whose last name is D-O-R-L-E, first name G-Y-U-M-E. He did the translation for it, and it's a version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And in there they discuss the idea that you have a finite attachment to the materium. And there was also a discussion in, I think it was the Nag Hammadi, that arises from the Gnostic understanding, and their understanding mirrors that of the Egyptians. And so you'll find that there's a reference into the book of Going Forth by Day, which is mistranslated as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And if you get a good translation of it, it will discuss the idea that the Atman, as the Hindus call it, the basic substance or glue that binds the soul within the materium, has a finite stickiness. And so if you were to, for instance, be a depressed soul and you reincarnated constantly and killed yourself constantly, you'd eventually wear out your stickiness and wouldn't be able to participate in the materium anymore. Make sense?
It does make sense. So
okay.
Even through that level, if somebody is constantly depressed and they're constantly committing suicide, then they're not aware that they can move to a higher level, that they don't have to keep repeating that?
Correct. They are so aware. And in fact, you find the level of delusion appears predictably, and that's a particular level of delusion that leads people to get caught into this like suicide trap, because it's a curious one. It was described in an ancillary book to the Science of Yoga, which of course I can't think of the name of it at the moment, but they described it as being a situation where it's kind of like a self-reinforcing loop. You kill yourself and that brings karma to you, because karma is action. The karmans are critters that love action, and they like strong dramatic action. They don't care if it's good, bad, or not. They just don't like the mediocre, indifferent kind of actions. But anyway, so you kill yourself and you get a bunch of karma with you. The next time you're born, you bring that bigger karmic burden back with you, which even further weighs down your depressed state, which leads you into choosing a life in which you're going to kill yourself again anyway. And it goes on and on and on. And so the discussion is about how there are predictable traps that exist within the Materium for the Materium players, if we want to think of it in that metaphor. And so our Materium handbook, which they of course forgot to give us when we showed up, should really state to us that players in the Materium need to be aware that rules and conditions apply across lives. And so like in other video games where you're given 9 lives or whatever and you pop up and go after you've been blown up, here you experience the reverse of that effect, in the sense that if you get blown up, you got to carry along the bad score with you from the previous version of the game.
Okay.
And that I think is actual. I've actually met an individual once, and then I was told about him performing a particular act and stating something and then killing himself. And I was aware that he had that particular understanding. And at the one little time a little interaction with him, I thought that was a weird way to think about karma. And he had thought that he had burned all of his karma in this life, and so to prevent further karma would kill himself. And so he did so, which is really dumb. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Well, I really enjoy this aspect of your interviews. I appreciate you taking time to go into detail and all that. Thank you very much.
Sure. That's the real woo-woo. That doesn't hurt at all. I don't have to really think. That's I've been in it so long, it just rolls right up.
Okay. One more thing, too. How do you personally balance or center yourself between the mundane world and the more enlightened world that we've been discussing?
I use Ni Kung in yoga.
And what was the first one? Ni Kung?
Yeah, Kung means work. Like Kung Fu is is hard work. Ni Kung is internal work.
Is that like Qigong?
Ni Kung is like the really hardcore truth that from which the current wave of Qigong stuff is extracted. It's a soft, watered-down version of what you go through. If you really went into Ni Kung and you went the whole route, you end up encountering the wushu, the martial arts expressions of it, where these guys, for instance, tie 100-pound weights to their testicles and walk around, that kind of thing. And so that's the far extreme of it. But there's a early balance level that is remarkable for keeping yourself strong as long as you remember to apply it. That's the real curse, of course, is I'm every bit a creature of my environment, and so I oscillate as much as everybody else. The fact that as I oscillate back through the center each time I grab that opportunity to do my exercises is probably the only thing that keeps me even remotely sane.
Okay, very good.
That and pie. And I know I've got a good peach pie down there calling me, so we'll have to wrap it up fairly quick, I think.
Okay, well, I'll let you go so that we can let other people ask the questions that they need to. Thanks so much.
Yeah, Cliff, we just got a couple more questions. Just in regards to the forecast, because we're talking about the metaphysical, about the caveman and other stuff like that. I mean, obviously the data wall is coming starting March 2012, so I would think a lot of your forecasts would probably halt at the hard stop. So what about the caveman? Any more information and all these other nice metaphysical stuff?
I don't know that that's a true assumption, that they halt. I'm thinking of it at this stage as the telescope breaks down, but the image of what you saw with the telescope way off in the distance does not necessarily, while the image goes away, the reality of it doesn't necessarily go away. So I don't know that that is true, that we run into a super hard stop. What I do know is true is that the system that I've got now and the infrastructure in which it operates runs into some kind of a wall that disrupts the system. It doesn't necessarily mean that the civilization is 100% disrupted or any of the other things are not still valid. So especially actually, I'm encouraged to hold that view by the unexpected appearance of all of the immediacy data, simply because I think of it as a situation of where it sort of makes sense that if our telescope is going to be disrupted, and it's a complex one, that the breakdown would be complex itself, and the breakdown would occur as a component of the reality that had been forecast, but not necessarily in any way defining the limits of that reality, if that makes sense. So in other words, it's as though our telescope is dissolving in our hands, but our hands are not necessarily affected. We just can't tell yet, while looking through the telescope, what the state of our hands is in a Heisenberg uncertainty principle kind of a deal, right? And we won't know until we take our eye away from the telescope when it finally breaks and look to see if our hands are there, if they're there or not. And so we're trapped in this Schrodinger's cat kind of, George Eure's goat kind of an issue. Is the goat there going to bleat at us or not? We just don't know until we actually look at it. So the assumption I don't know is valid. It could be, but I don't assume that it is. Make sense?
It does, yes. Forum member Odison's question was, do you think some people have a better tuned subconscious lexicon or better access to their subconscious lexicon than others, enabling them to create more accurate future-looking art like movies, books, music, etc.?
Sure. I think there's absolutely all kinds of evidence to that, and I think there's a common correlation to a lot of it, and it has to do with certain psychotropic drugs that influence the connection between the grapheme to phoneme pathway within the mind.
Okay,
we also find, as an aside, that there's a naturally occurring form of it that afflicts people with what we currently call dyslexia. And if you get into individuals like that, I think they are certainly within that population is certainly a very high statistical correlation to just those sorts of expressions. That is future-looking, really cool art that presays the future, etc.
Okay. Just second last question, Cliff. With going back to the data gap, basically, your premise, yours premise was that it could be the hard stop could be due to the internet. Now, the internet has grown, I think, 400% since 2000 to 2009. So, if it was the internet, then the holes would be due to internet activity or people dropping off. So, but it looks like the internet's growing and more people are using the internet. So, how do you reconcile that?
Well, there's actually very easy ways to reconcile it, and that is that the rates of internet growth are not necessarily being reported as we understand them. In other words, there may be far more amounts of growth in the internet relative to bit traffic being reported as a 400% growth, and that bit traffic might actually be video, which consumes more bits and bytes to transfer the same amount of information. And so in that sense, we haven't really grown. We've just converted the media over to a denser pack, so to speak. So that would reconcile that view, that the reporting of the internet statistics are inaccurate at our current level. However, I do not think that is the case. I think that indeed the internet has grown, and I can reconcile it to our data gap in a number of ways, either outright fascistic censorship at a hard level, fascistic censorship at a soft level, which I experience now in some areas such as China and Australia and other ways, and or physical disruption to the internet in the form of shutdown due to global rev, which shows a real high level of probability of continuing, and indeed will force them to drastically alter the electronic communications at the powers that be level. They're going to have a hard question to answer here, probably about the time of the September equinox. And we'll see whether they continue to support the internet and its spawn, the cell phone, thereafter. And then there's, of course, the other disruption potential is that something happens to me, or I make a decision not to do it, or there is a total breakdown in our ability here due to something, like an earthquake, and or space aliens come down and snatch my ass off to Mars. So any of those account for it, as do other more cataclysmic levels of understanding. We can, because we're dealing in such a huge area of the unknown, that it occasionally is right and that it is occasionally correct at a level that exceeds chance. We make certain assumptions that I just don't know are valid, even 12 years on.
Maybe we should have a dummy's guide to 101 theories on the data gap. But anyway, that's for later.
I know, we wouldn't have time to bring it out. I was, really going to work on doing a book and stuff, and it's like, I've looked at the data and there's just not enough time at this point. And if we pull our way from the telescope here in the year 2012 and my hands still exist, maybe I'll do the book then.
In closing, Cliff, we have one last question from Patrick, which we think all pie eaters really want to know. While we're waiting for the grunch of giants and baking pies, I'd like to know what we could use instead of butter and or shortening to fold in for a delicate and flaky crust. Post-Walmart days, I mean, pies are art, after all, and it's all in the palate and presentation.
Correct, and that's you can use oils. You can't use such a thing as an aromatic olive oil, for instance. But if you do use oil, the reason that the hydrogenated oils or the solid oils like butter turn out so well is the way in which they bind to the ends of the little flour molecules with the water. And so this little electrical charge component that causes this three-way bind that creates flakiness is not usually found in oil crusts, and thus we see an attempt to leaven it in there by using, in oil crusts you'll find frequently they use eggs or they'll use leavening ingredients like baking soda or baking powder in small amounts. But you can achieve the same thing by slightly altering your process. And at the end of the process of intermixing the oil with the flour, and you've really got to be good at it in a way you don't with the hydrogenated solid fats. I mean, you really got to get in there and grind that oil into the flour to the point where you're not talking pea-sized lumps. You're talking about a homogeneous mass of little tiny bits of flour and oil molecules with the water, and then freeze it. And just mix the water in. And don't touch the dough, just wrap it all up and stick it in your freezer and freeze it while you deal with the middle of the pie. Now, I had to do that today, but I was doing it today because I'm dealing with a peach pie, and I like to let the dough rest while I'm dealing with the filling so that I can then go and work on the dough. And during the period of time that I take to work on the dough, the flour and sugars have started to work on the just sliced peaches to start that bonding process that is necessary for them to all set up before the flour gets hot. With some fruit like peaches and nectarines and this kind of thing, apricots even both dried and fresh, when you mix the flour in to set them up as a pie filling, you want to give them time to bind to the flour before heat is applied. Otherwise, the ends of the flour get cooked off before they've had a chance to bond to the proteins that are found in that fruit, unlike things like berry pies where one might use tapioca. Okay?
Yes, thanks again for your time, Cliff.
Sure.
A few months ago, you replied to a forum member, Green Meadow, saying that perhaps many of us webbotters like you were not total strangers after all, and that in past lives we may have been brothers and sisters fighting side by side against the powers that were. This reminded me of a quote by poet Samuel Johnson. Great works are performed not by strength, but by perseverance. Your perseverance has helped many to continue to fight the good fight, and though the future is difficult to predict, thanks to your perseverance and ours, I think the final outcome is clear and inevitable. On behalf of Fox and all the members of the WebBot Forum, we thank you, sir. May you and your family have many pies to come.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Cliff.
Thanks for the opportunity, guys. It's really a privilege and an honor. And I've discovered to my horror I'm a man of honor because that puts all kinds of responsibility on you, including being expressive of emotions when you find that you really should. And so it's something my wife has always said, you've got to be more gracious and all of this kind of stuff. She's quite right. And I'm gradually maturing into that. And I have a great deal of gratitude to all of you guys. I think you're absolute idiots, and we got to get over this cult of personality. But I'm still truly grateful.
Thanks, Cliff.
Thanks.
Talk to you guys later.
Thank you,
Bye.
Cliff.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Bye.
Cliff.
Thank you, Cliff.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.